Alice Ruggles was born on December 24th, 1991, exactly one day before Christmas. Her parents, Sue Hills and Clive Ruggles, already had two children, and later another boy was born in the family. They lived in the tiny English village of Torlangton, located in Leicestershire County. The family was very close-knit, and the older children always took care of Alice and her younger brother. In the local school, the girl started attending a drama club and quickly fell in love with acting. She participated in many theatrical productions, and all her teachers noted her natural talent. After graduating from high school, at the age of 18, Alice enrolled in Northumbria University, where she studied design. After receiving her diploma in 2014, she moved to a city called Gateshead and got a job at the major British media company Sky. Alice rented an apartment with her roommates because it was difficult for her to afford separate housing at first. In October 2015, when the young woman was 23, she met a man named Harry Dhillon. He stumbled upon her account on Facebook through a mutual friends page. They started talking and soon became fond of each other. Harry was from India and came to Great Britain through a student program. He transferred from a local Indian university to Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh. After completing his studies, he decided to stay in England and join the army. After some time, he was sent to Afghanistan, where he started communicating with Alice on Facebook. At first, they just exchanged messages, then began calling each other several times a week, and eventually started a relationship. They eagerly awaited the moment when Harry would return to Great Britain to finally meet. When it happened, they went on several dates, and Harry made a good impression on Alice. They had a great time, and the mutual attraction between them only grew stronger. However, after a few weeks, they had to separate again. Harry had to go back to Afghanistan for 2 more months, after which they planned to continue their relationship. The couple continued to communicate online until Harry finally returned to England in April. He lived in a military base in Edinburgh, which was almost 200 kilometers away from the city where Alice lived, but Harry tried to visit her whenever he could. Months after Harry's return to England, Alice invited him to a family celebration, and it seemed like their relationship was getting stronger. But over time, acquaintances began to notice significant changes in her behavior. Previously, she was always cheerful, sociable, and positive, but something was changing in her every day. Alice became withdrawn, depressed, and stopped spending time with friends. She even stopped communicating with them in social media, and no one could understand what was happening to her. Alice became more irritable, and at one point, she had a fight with her apartment neighbors. She packed her things and moved to her colleague's apartment. Alice's family and friends began to suspect that her new boyfriend Harry was the cause of these significant changes. At first, she was reluctant to share her relationship problems, but it became impossible to hide them over time. It turned out that Harry was not the kind and caring man he was in the first months after they met. The longer their relationship lasted, the more he tried to control every aspect of Alice's life. Harry was against her hanging out with friends or talking to other men, even if they were her old acquaintances or work colleagues. He began to monitor her social media conversations and constantly accused her of wanting to cheat on him. Every time she talked to friends or planned to go out with them, Harry would throw a tantrum. But what was even more interesting, Harry began openly cheating on Alice, meeting women from Tinder for one-night stands without any commitment. After that, he often talked about these women to Alice to make her jealous. It even got to the point where one of these women wrote to Alice on social media in August. At that moment, the young woman decided to break up with Harry, but he didn't want to let her go. He bombarded Alice with messages and calls, trying to get her back by any means necessary. At first, he said that he loved her, cried on the phone, and promised to change for the better. Then he began openly manipulating the young woman, promising to take his own life and blaming her for everything. It even got to direct threats. It turned out that Harry had secretly taken pictures of Alice while she was changing clothes, and he threatened to post these pictures on the internet if she didn't come back to him. In the end, Alice decided to simply ignore him. And then Harry changed tactics. He started calling her friends and relatives, asking them to reason with the young woman. Realizing that this also didn't work, he began writing her letters with poems about his love for her. However, soon he once again resorted to threats and blackmail. But Alice still didn't respond to these letters. Later, it turned out that Harry had managed to hack her Facebook account and was monitoring her correspondence. From there, he found out that since September, Alice had started communicating with a man named Mike, who was an army officer and was in another country at the time. Harry was furious. He began writing to Mike that Alice was still in love with him and sleeping with him, and also wrote various nasty things about her. But by that time, Mike already knew about Harry and didn't pay any attention to his words. He continued his relationship with Alice, and it seemed that the young woman had managed to get out of this whole situation with Harry. She became sociable, cheerful, and happy again. But unfortunately, this didn't last long. On September 30th, Harry left her a voice message begging her to pick up the phone. Alice ignored him, and then he decided to go to her house. The man drove 2.5 hours from his military base to her apartment, but then he behaved quite strangely. First, he rang the doorbell and ran away. Alice was at home, but she didn't open the door because she didn't see anyone through the peephole. The situation repeated several times. Then, a few hours later, Harry climbed over the fence and approached the window of her bedroom. Alice lived on the first floor of a 2-story house with a fenced area. Harry knocked on the window and hid, leaving a box of candy and a bouquet on the windowsill. What happened greatly frightened Alice. She immediately understood that Harry was behind all of it. Additionally, when she approached the window, she briefly saw a man hiding outside her field of view. But that wasn't all. While hiding in her yard, Harry recorded several creepy voice messages, the content of which caused Alice real panic. One of them began with the words, "You said guys like me end up killing people." After these words, he began repeating multiple times that he didn't want to kill her. From his voice, Alice felt like he was primarily trying to convince himself of what he said. Finally, he wished her good night and left. All of this was already enough for Alice to contact the police. After what happened, she began to seriously fear for her life and didn't know how else to protect herself from Harry. The operator offered her 2 options for solving the problem. She could obtain a restraining order against Harry or ask the police to issue an official police information notice, known in Great Britain as a PIN, and allowed the police to arrest the man if he approached or contacted Alice. The young woman chose the latter option. The next day, the police came to her, took a statement, and assured her that Harry would face the consequences if he bothered her again. After some time, the police called the military unit and informed the commanding officer about the measures taken against Harry. Interestingly, the police did not contact him personally, even by phone, let alone a personal visit, although they were obliged to do so by law. Learning that Alice had contacted the police, he became angry and wrote her another letter, along with a box of items that reminded him of her. In the letter, he said that because of her complaint, his phone, tablet, and laptop were taken away from him. He also promised not to bother her again. But Alice knew for sure he wouldn't just calm down like that. When she first contacted the police, they told her to call them immediately if Harry contacted her again, so she did. She told the operator about the letter and the box of items, but he didn't know what action to take in this case. Moreover, he asked Alice herself what actions she expected from them. In the end, he promised her that another officer would call her back. Of course, this response from the police shocked Alice, and she had no idea what to do next. Several hours later, an officer did call her back and listened to her entire story. He then asked if she wanted the police to arrest Harry, and here Alice made a fatal mistake. She felt sorry for him and answered negatively. However, even if he had been arrested, Harry would not have received any punishment. He would have been held for some time in the station and released. After this, Alice realized that the police could not help her in the situation that had arisen, so she was left to rely only on herself. On October 12th, 5 days after she went to the police, Alice remained depressed and frightened. She hoped to distract herself from these troubling thoughts over the weekend. Mike was supposed to come see her, and they planned to spend the next few days together. That evening, Alice returned home from work, and her neighbor was not home. She began to prepare for bed while chatting with Mike about their upcoming meeting, but she did not know that Harry had been standing in the courtyard of her building and watching her. Taking advantage of the fact that Alice had left the window slightly open, he climbed into her bedroom and went to the kitchen, where he took a knife and went to the bathroom where Alice was. The events that followed unfolded rapidly. Harry struck her 24 times with the knife, causing Alice to die almost instantly. After that, he left the apartment, got into his car, and drove back to his military unit. In less than an hour, Alice's neighbor returned home and found that the front door was locked from the inside. She knocked several times, hoping Alice would answer, but she did not. Then the neighbor went to the backyard to knock on the window of Alice's bedroom, but what she saw shocked her. Through the open window, she saw Alice laying on the bathroom floor in a pool of blood. She immediately called the police in a panic and told them what had happened, adding, "We knew this was going to happen. Her ex is a real psychopath." Less than 2 minutes later, the neighbor heard police sirens approaching, and with them came paramedics who confirmed Alice's death. It became immediately obvious to them that the conversation was about a murder, in connection with the fact that the neighbor named Harry Dhillon as a potential killer. The police immediately began to search for him. After running the numbers of his car, they found that the man had driven from Edinburgh to Newcastle that day. His car appeared on several surveillance cameras. Just a few hours later, the police arrived at the military base and arrested Harry. They took him to the station and began to interrogate him. The man admitted that he had gone to see Alice, but denied any involvement in the murder. According to him, he came to talk to her, and she allegedly came out onto the street and hit him in the face during the conversation. After that, Harry allegedly got into his car and drove back to the base, but detectives quickly found out that his story had nothing to do with reality. From the surveillance cameras, they learned that Harry had arrived at Alice's house even before she returned from work. He parked his car and waited. But that's not all. Investigators examined his phone and found that while Harry was sitting in the car, he was messaging with a random girl on Tinder and arranging to meet her that same night. Detectives also found bloodstains on the steering wheel of Harry's car, and analysis showed that this blood belonged to Alice. Moreover, the man stole her phone and took it with him, which is why the geolocation of the device completely matched the movements of the killer that day. All of this was enough to bring charges of murder and send the case to court. However, the first hearing took place only almost a year later, in April 2017. Harry's lawyers realized that with such a set of evidence against their client, they needed to come up with a new story. As a result, the man claimed that he had actually come to Alice's house to collect his things, but they had an argument, and then Alice allegedly took a knife and attacked him, accidentally inflicting 24 wounds on herself. After that, he watched her die and even heard her last words. She allegedly said that she hated her family. Of course, this delusional story was not taken seriously. Moreover, during the court hearings, another gruesome fact emerged. Before the murder, Harry had visited Alice's house several times, sneaked into the backyard, and took pictures. According to the prosecution, he carefully planned the murder in advance. 11 days later, the court handed down a guilty verdict: life imprisonment with the possibility of applying for parole in 22 years. During a reading of the verdict, the judge noted that Harry showed no remorse or compassion. Instead, he was focused only on inventing the most plausible story. Another horrific detail from Harry's past came to light during the trial. 3 years before these events, his ex-girlfriend obtained a restraining order against him because he was stalking her in the same way he would later stalk Alice, but the police simply did not know about it. After the murder, society and the media harshly criticized the police, accusing them of failing to protect Alice from a dangerous psychopath, letting the case go unchecked. Later, 2 officers were disciplined. The army also came under fire. The public was outraged that such an unbalanced and dangerous person was allowed to join. In addition, no action was taken against Harry when the PIN was issued against him. Sometime later, Alice's family launched a foundation named in her honor. Its goal was to work towards ensuring the victims of stalking receive immediate and proper assistance from the police. Alice's case showed that law enforcement agencies simply cannot provide such protection, so legislative changes are needed. In 2019, a law was passed that simplifies the issuance of restraining orders against people who stalk their victims. However, Alice's family continues to work on the foundation and hopes that it will help change the situation in the country for the better. Now, all her relatives and acquaintances believe that this tragedy could have been avoided if the police had taken their duties more seriously. A young girl was found dead in her own apartment in an upscale apartment building that was under 24-hour security. The police tried to solve this gruesome mystery for 2 weeks, and only dozens of surveillance tapes helped them discover the sad truth. Sasha Samsudyan was born on July 4, 1988, in New York City. After high school, she moved to Florida, where she graduated from a local university. After receiving her degree, she took a job as a social media manager for a real estate agency in Orlando. Her career took off quickly. She received solid bonuses and awards for her good work. Sasha's friends spoke of her as a friendly, sweet, and outgoing girl with a big heart. She was a member of several charitable foundations, taking an active part in their activities. On October 16, 2015, it was the last day of the soccer season in Orlando. Sasha and her friends went to the stadium to support their favorite team. The match ended in victory, and the company went to the popular Attic nightclub downtown to celebrate. After spending there a few hours, Sasha left the club around 1:30. As it turned out later, she hadn't told her friends where she planned to go. She could have gone home or to another bar. Before she left, she arranged to have breakfast in the morning with her friend Anthony, who was at the club that night. The next day, he arrived at the cafe at the appointed time, but the girl never showed up. She also did not answer her cell phone or social media messages. Such behavior was not typical for Sasha. She was always in touch and would not ignore Anthony, especially when they had agreed to meet in advance. At first he thought she was just slipping it off after the party last night, but several hours passed and there was no answer. Then the young man began to seriously worry about Sasha. Anthony, along with 2 of Sasha's closest friends, went to her apartment in the secure Uptown Place apartment complex, where she had rented an apartment for the past 6 months. When they drove up to her house, they found the girl's car parked in the parking lot. Inside the car, the friends noticed a box of children's toys. On that day, Sasha was supposed to go to a baby shower at her acquaintance's house. but the gift was still in the car. When they got to the door of the apartment, they started knocking and calling out for Sasha, but all they got was silence. It all looked extremely disturbing, and the friends decided to call 911. The squad arrived at her house around 8 p.m. The cops asked the guards to open the apartment door with the spare key and went inside. At first glance, there were no signs of a struggle in the apartment, but as soon as the officers entered the bedroom, a gruesome discovery awaited them. Sasha's arm and hair were sticking out from under the blanket of the bed. It was clear almost at once that the police were dealing with a murder. There were clear signs of strangulation on her neck. In addition, her torn t-shirt was lying nearby, the same one the girl wore to the stadium. This could indicate that the attack took place immediately after Sasha came home. The pendant she always wore was also torn from her neck. For Sasha's relatives and friends, this event came as a real shock. She had always been a kind and cheerful person, and it simply didn't make sense that someone would hurt her in such a cruel way. In talking to the police, her family and friends couldn't name a single person with whom Sasha might have had problems. Detectives began their search for evidence, and the first thing they noticed was the persistent smell of detergent in the apartment. The cabinet with the household chemicals was open. This indicated that the perpetrator was trying to wash away traces of his presence. He only partially succeeded, however. Detectives also found an empty contraceptive wrapper in the hallway and a shoe print near the girl's bed. Once in the bathroom, they found that the toilet seat was up, despite the fact that the girl lived alone. Experts found a fingerprint on it that didn't belong to Sasha. No other clues were found in the apartment. In addition, there were no keys, no smartphone, and no purse belonging to Sasha. Soon after came the report of medical experts. They confirmed that the girl died of strangulation. One of the doctors said he had never seen such severe injuries to the neck as in this case. This would seem to indicate that the attacker was physically well prepared. In addition, the experts determined that Sasha had been abused. They were also able to find a DNA sample from an unknown male on the girl's body. Unfortunately, there were no matches with him in the databases. In the meantime, the detectives began searching for witnesses and first questioned the security guard who was on duty that night. It was 33-year-old Stephen Duxbury, a former Marine. The management of the apartment complex had hired men with impressive experience in the police, army, and other specialized services, but even that did not help Sasha. Stephen said he saw the girl that night. He said she was very drunk and tried to get into the building, but she couldn't. The girl was missing her keys, badge, and smartphone. According to the rules, the security guard could not open her door without a pass, ID, or proof of residency. For this reason, Stephen refused to let her in. Sometime later, he went on a routine patrol and saw that Sasha had somehow made it onto the compound after all. He assumed that the girl had entered the building with another resident who opened the door with her pass, but the girl ran into a new problem. To get into the apartment, she needed a key, which she did not have. Each door in the complex also opened with a code lock, but Sasha couldn't remember the right code. She turned to Stephen and asked him to walk her to her car to look there for the keys again. Without the guard with his pass, she would no longer be able to get into the complex. Steve went with her, but there were no keys in the car. Sasha suddenly stated that she remembered the code to the door and they went back to her apartment. But there again, the girl was unable to enter the correct password. After that, the guard said he had to go back to his post. He promised to help her solve the problem if at the time of his next round, Sasha still could not remember the right code. However, the next time he went to patrol the area, Sasha was nowhere to be found. It was not until the morning that Stephen noticed her in the company of a man he had not seen in the complex before. The guard failed to describe his appearance in detail, so the police had to look for this unknown man practically at random. We could only hope that this man might have been caught on one of the 15 security cameras set up on each floor of the building and near the exit. In addition, the detectives requested footage from cameras located along Sasha's route from the club to his home, a 10-block stretch. On such a stretch, there was almost a 100% chance that the girl was caught in the lens of at least a few cameras. After studying the footage from the club and the surrounding area, investigators immediately spotted Sasha. They could see her leave the establishment and head in the direction of the house. She stood out with her brightly colored outfit. She was wearing white pants, a purple t-shirt, and flip-flops. You could see in these dark shots that the girl was stumbling and staggering slightly. This indicated that Sasha had been drinking quite a bit of alcohol in the club, which matched the security guard's testimony. It was also apparent that Sasha left the club alone. A little later, another camera caught her, and this time she was walking in the company of two girls. The police showed their pictures to Sasha's friends, but no one recognized them. This led the detectives to believe that the three met on the street. It was important for the detectives to find these girls because they might have valuable information. To do this, they sent their photos to the local media, and soon the women were identified. During the interrogation, the girls said that they saw Sasha on the street. At that moment, two men approached her and tried to get acquainted with her. Given that it was late at night, the girls were afraid for Sasha and decided to walk home with her. This helped get rid of those annoying men. After walking some distance, the girl suggested that Sasha call her an Uber. Since she didn't have her phone or any other personal belongings with her, they went with her to her house and awaited until she got into the house. Given that she didn't have a pass, Sasha had to wait for some other guest to open the door. At 1:46 a.m., the cameras caught a man approaching Sasha and talking to her about something. It turned out that it was a resident of the complex who opened the door for her with his pass. Thus, investigators learned the exact time when the girl was able to get into the building. The man was no longer on camera, so the detectives did not consider him a suspect. The cops continued to study the footage and 20 minutes later noticed something else interesting. All the cameras in the building also recorded sound, and at one point, outside the camera's field of view, they heard footsteps. The investigators concluded that Sasha was working next to this camera in the corridor of the building. The next time she was spotted was at 2:25 a.m., but already in the company of a security guard. They headed in the direction of the parking lot and then returned to the compound. This also coincided with Steven's story. After that, Sasha was not caught on any cameras, and the detectives were at a standstill again. The police decided to question the guys Sasha had been in a relationship with in the past. This idea had to do with the method of murder. More often than not, strangulation is motivated by passion, and the culprit is someone close to them. The first guy's name was Taylor. He and Sasha broke up a long time ago, but continued their friendship. He worked as a bartender and was on duty until 9:30 p.m. on October 16th. He voluntarily provided the detectives with his DNA sample, which did not match the sample found on Sasha's body. A man named Ben was called next for questioning. In addition to being in a relationship with Sasha, he was also the last person she wrote to before she died. Detectives discovered that at 5:12 a.m., Sasha had sent him a text message that only included his name, Ben. This was very strange, especially when you remember that according to the story of the security guard and the two girls, Sasha didn't have her phone when she returned from the club. Investigators also learned that Sasha had planned to meet Ben this weekend. However, the man had an alibi. On the night of the murder, he was with friends. In addition, he voluntarily provided a DNA sample, which also came back negative. By that time, the detectives had finished examining all the available camera footage and noticed something strange. When questioned, security guard Steven Duxburg said that his shift ended at exactly 6 in the morning, after which he went home. But one of the cameras captured him leaving the building at 6:36 a.m., and that was not all. It was holding 2 large trash bags with red handles. Exactly the same ones were lying in Sasha's apartment. After speaking with the management of the apartment complex, the police learned that it was not the responsibility of the security guards to take out the trash. A logical question arises: why was Steven late for work for almost an hour, hiding this fact from the police and carrying garbage bags allegedly taken from Sasha's apartment? Given all these suspicious points, investigators offered the security guard a polygraph interrogation. When asked if he had ever entered Sasha's apartment, Steven answered in the negative, and the machine recorded the lie. Next, he was asked if he knew how Sasha died. 3 different questions came up. Was she poisoned, attacked with a sharp object, or strangled? At the last question, Stephen's pulse jumped sharply. Information about the girl's cause of death had not been released anywhere, and the guards simply couldn't know. Even when the police came to Sasha's apartment with the other guards, they were not allowed inside. It turns out that Stephen could only know the correct answer if he was in the girl's apartment at the time of the murder. Despite all this, it is almost impossible to convict a person on the basis of a polygraph reading alone, so the police had to look for additional evidence. Investigators asked Stephen to show them the shoes he was wearing that night. He provided them with a pair of shoes, and their soles did not match the footprint found in Sasha's apartment. However, the detectives also obtained a search warrant for his apartment, where they found other shoes, and they showed an exact match. Moreover, the fingerprint from the toilet in Sasha's apartment matched Stephen's. By taking his DNA sample, experts quickly found a perfect match with a sample found of Sasha's body. Police learned even more gruesome details after examining Stephen's phone. At about 5 a.m., he was searching on Google for how to quickly pick a combination lock door. The same one had been installed on the door of Sasha's apartment. Detectives finally found a severe bite mark on Stephen's arm, as well as numerous scratches on his body. All this was enough to arrest the man and charge him with murder. With that set of evidence, no one had any doubt about a conviction anymore. According to the investigation, Stephen saw that Sasha was heavily intoxicated and decided to take advantage of it. After waiting for some time after the girl entered her apartment, he opened the electronic log, and then he abused and killed the girl. Only one question remains unclear. Judging by the bites and scratches on Stephen's body, Sasha struggled to fight back and most likely screamed. How come none of the neighbors heard that? The house she lived in was quite old, and the noise insulation there must have been extremely mediocre. After Stephen had finished with Sasha, he began to cover his tracks. The man took cleaner from her closet, spilled it all over the apartment and even on Sasha's body. He then collected all the evidence into bags, which he later got on camera with. Apparently, he either didn't think about the fingerprint on the rim of the toilet bowl or he forgot. Stephen's trial began in November 2017. His lawyer immediately demanded that several key pieces of evidence be excluded from consideration because his client had allegedly been misled. This included boots found in his apartment as well as polygraph evidence. The news media hyped the story as if the judge was ready to honor the request, but that never happened. All the evidence remained in the case file. However, even without it, Stephen's chances of an acquittal were too small. The lawyer also tried to play on the fact that the investigation did not have any camera footage showing his client entering Sasha's apartment, but this attempt was developed by the fact that his fingerprints and DNA were inside the apartment. Finally, the lawyer stated that there may have been voluntary sexual intercourse between Stephen and Sasha that night, and when the security guard left, someone else broke into the apartment and killed her. Of course, this attempt also went nowhere. The trial lasted only a week, which is very short by US standards. After a 4-hour deliberation, the judge handed down a verdict: life in prison for the murder and an additional 15 years for the breaking and theft. After the verdict was pronounced, Sasha's parents made a speech. They thanked the police for their quick and high-quality investigation and expressed their condolences to Stephen's mother, who was present at the hearing. They noted that Stephen's parents had also lost their child that day. Shortly thereafter, Sasha's family sued the management of the complex, which was responsible for selecting security guards, as well as the manufacturer of the code locks. During the proceedings, it emerged that other residents of the complex had repeatedly complained about Stephen's molestation, but management took no action. As for the lock, lawyers for the Samsuddian family insisted that the model did not meet security requirements. They cited as evidence an article that described how to open such a lock with a simple screwdriver in seconds. In February 2019, Stephen tried to appeal his conviction, but the court dismissed his claim. In memory of their daughter, Sasha's parents decided to help the families and other victims cope with their grief. With such a tragic experience under their belt, they could find the right words and phrases to ease their suffering. The outcome of this story is very sad. The man who had been tasked with guarding people turned out to be a murderer.
Just a few queries on Google helped him open the door of someone else's apartment without too much trouble. The two girls who met Sasha that night deserve special mention. They didn't just call her a cab on their own account, but drove with her to make sure she got home and was safe. Unfortunately, it was within the walls of her own home that the main danger to Sasha lurked.
This story began in the sunny American state of Hawaii. In early 1977, a young couple, 26-year-old Mark Barnes and 31-year-old Charlotte Moriarty, had a son named Marks. It seemed that a happy and carefree future awaited the family among palm trees, sunshine, and boundless ocean. Mark worked as a veterinarian and Charlotte was an artist. The couple wasn't married, which didn't stop them from loving their child and giving him the best of everything. Before meeting Mark, Charlotte had been married and had a daughter who stayed to live with her father in New Mexico. After the divorce, her mother kept in contact with her and tried to visit her whenever possible. Fast forward to June 21st, 1977. On that day, Mark had been working on the property since early in the morning, and the man was planting Charlotte's favorite flowers around it. The girl told him she wanted to walk to the store, so as not to distract Mark from his work, she decided to take her son with her, put him in the stroller, and left. A few hours passed. Mark was so worked up that he didn't immediately realize. Charlotte should have been back by now, since the store was only a few blocks away. After waiting a few more hours, he decided to walk to that store in hopes of meeting Charlotte on the way. As he stepped away from the house, he saw his son's empty stroller standing near the bus stop. Neither the child nor Charlotte was anywhere to be found. It would seem that he should have gone to the police immediately after that, but Mark didn't. As he explained later, Charlotte could sometimes go somewhere for a few days unannounced and then return home. The man decided that this time would be no exception. It sounds strange enough that if Charlotte had gone out alone, Mark's logic could still be understood. But she had taken her 6-month-old baby with her, abandoned the stroller in the middle of the street, and seemed to have vanished. 2 days passed, but Charlotte never showed up. Then Mark decided to call the police, and they advised him to wait a few more days. What if the girl and the baby still returned home? So he did, and 2 days later, he called the police again. This time he was asked for a description of Charlotte and the child, and then they promised to start a search. But after that call, no one contacted Mark, and the fate of his girlfriend and son remained a mystery. 3 weeks passed. Mark decided to go to the police station to see how the search was going, and here the strangeness continued. There he was told that no calls had been received from him. The police allegedly couldn't find any evidence that Mark, over the phone, had told them about the missing girl and child. Of course, no case was open and no one was looking for the missing all this time. Let's dwell on this point in more detail. Mark assured everyone that he had called the police twice. The police said that every call was registered and that there had simply been no calls. It is unclear which of them is right, but both scenarios are plausible. If the police really did refuse to start looking for the 6-month-old, they could have been in serious trouble. Missing small children obliged the police to search immediately, even if only a few hours have passed since the disappearance. So in this case, the police may well have covered up the fact that they did not search for the infant. The father's behavior also seems strange. Why did he wait several days before calling the police? And were there any such calls? Even if he did call, why did he wait 3 more weeks after those calls and only then decide to go to the station? After all, in all that time, he had not even called there to find out anything about the progress of the investigation. In his conversation with the detectives, Mark reported that Charlotte might have some kind of mental health problem. In the 70s, psychiatry was still gaining ground, so no treatment had been given to the girl. Neither she nor Mark even went to the hospital, even though there were very serious reasons to do so. According to Mark, Charlotte walked around the house for the first few weeks after giving birth with only a blindfold on and couldn't properly explain why. Given that there couldn't possibly be a logical explanation here, Mark was worried beyond belief and was already thinking about seeing doctors. But then Charlotte removed the blindfold and began to behave completely normally. The man decided to forget the story and not to pay any attention to it. That Charlotte's disappearance could be related to mental problems was indirectly suggested by another fact. Mark said that her daughter, who was 8 years old at the time, was going to fly to Hawaii in June to visit her mother. Charlotte was looking forward to that meeting, but at the last minute the girl's father canceled all plans and told Charlotte that they will not come this summer. This very much upset the girl, and mental disorders can be provoked by strong negative emotions that Charlotte experienced. Even in the quietest stages of a life, a person does not show any signs of unstable psyche. But all these theories did not bring the police any closer to finding the girl and her son. They opened a case, posted flyers all over the place, and couldn't find a single clue. Mark later recounted that for a year and a half after Charlotte and his son disappeared, he became obsessed with searching for them. He drove all over the island, hoping to find them alive and unharmed, but it never happened. 2 years after they went missing, he moved to California. Nor did the police have much hope in the case. Given the complete lack of evidence, no one believed that the girl and child could be found. Compounding the situation was the fact that crucial time for the search had been lost in the first few days. 24 years had passed. Mark had started a new family, and he had 2 daughters. He had long ago stopped believing that he would one day see Charlotte and Mark's alive. But in 2001, the case took a new turn. Charlotte's daughter from her first marriage, Jennifer, flew to Hawaii and went to the police station. She convinced them to reopen the case of her mother's disappearance. The detectives agreed, put Charlotte and Mark's information into the missing persons database, and created a computer portrait of Mark's growing up based on his childhood photo. The first thing the detectives decided to do was to interrogate Mark because his behavior in the early stages of the investigation seemed strange to them. There was no mention in the old documents that the man had called the police station by phone 2 days after the girl and child disappeared. It said he did not come to the police station until 3 weeks later. This led detectives to believe that Mark may have been involved in their disappearance. Even though 24 years had passed since then, the police tried to find any witnesses who lived near Mark and Charlotte's home. Of course, most of the residents had already changed, but the detectives were lucky enough to find one senior citizen who had lived there back then. He remembered Mark and Charlotte and told the detectives an interesting fact. According to the pensioner, the couple often quarreled, and he heard them shouting. The detectives then decided that the case was getting close to a solution and Mark was indeed guilty. He was called in for questioning and told about the witness who had heard his regular arguments with Charlotte. Mark did not deny that there had indeed been verbal altercations between them. He also asked to see a married couple who would never fight. Detectives tried with all their might to prove his guilt and offered Mark to voluntarily undergo an interrogation with a polygraph. The results were ambiguous. The specialist who read the testimony could not give a clear answer whether the man was guilty or not. A polygraph is inherently an overrated instrument. It is not physically capable of showing whether a suspect is lying or not. Dozens of factors can affect its results. Lies can be mistaken for the truth and vice versa. If an innocent person is very nervous during an interrogation or withholds completely different information that is relevant to the questions, the polygraph can make him out to be a liar. In Mark's case, the polygraph was of no use either, but the detectives decided to go at it from a different angle. They obtained a warrant to examine the house where Charlotte and Mark lived in 1977. What interested them the most was the terrace, built shortly after the girl and child went missing. They speculated that Charlotte might not have gone anywhere that day, but might have been hurt by her husband in another quarrel and ended up in the ground under the terrace. It is not clear how the police imagined the events of that day and how an infant fits into the story, but they had no other versions. Forensics dug through the backyard and examined the terrace, but they were unable to find any trace of anyone's remains there. It is not known if they compensated the new owners of the house for the 2 days of digging in the backyard. The detectives admitted they had nothing else to work with and set the case aside again. As the last resort, they took DNA samples from Jennifer and Mark, hoping it would someday help. The case went to a long drawer again for a full 10 years. But after that time came the grand finale to this whole tangled story. Steve Carter, 35 of Philadelphia, had wondered about his past from an early age. He grew up in an orphanage, and at the age of 4, he was installed by a wealthy New Jersey couple. The U.S. Army officer and his wife loved the baby and cared for him as their own. Steve also loved his foster parents, but he always wondered how he ended up in the orphanage. In 2011, he stumbled upon an internet article that told the amazing story of Caroline White, who had been kidnapped from the hospital when she was just 19 days old. Decades later, Caroline was browsing missing children's websites, found her childhood photo there, and realized with horror that it was her current parents who had kidnapped her from the hospital. Steve Carter was inspired by the story and began researching the same sites. He entered his birth information on his certificate and was immediately speechless. The first result showed an adult photo of him taken by artists based on a baby picture. The resemblance was so strong that Carter could not even move in shock. He realized he was the same Max Barnes who had gone missing in Hawaii with his birth mother. After recovering from his shock, Steve made the decision to take a DNA test, taking the opportunity through a missing child search service. Their database contained DNA samples of Mark and Jennifer taken by the police 10 years earlier. After 8 months of waiting, the test showed an exact match. Steve Carter turned out to be Mark's Barnsom. Police instantly reopened the investigation. The missing infant found himself 34 years later, but the circumstances of his disappearance were still a mystery, but not for long. His birth certificate helped solve the mystery. First, the certificate was not issued until a year after the birth of the child. Second, his name was Tenzin Amia and his mother's name was Jane Amia. That's what helped the police to connect the two key strands, because that name had already appeared in the reports. Not long after Charlotte and the child disappeared, the police received a strange call. A woman reported that a girl with an infant baby had knocked on the door in her house and asked for milk to feed her. The police arrived on the scene, believing that the girl was in an inadequate state. She was taken to a psychiatric clinic for evaluation, and the infant was handed over to the guardianship authorities. This girl was Charlotte. After a few days in the hospital, she secretly escaped and was never seen again, and the child remained in the care of the state, because he did not even have a birth certificate and it was impossible to identify his relatives. When the truth came out, everyone had a legitimate question: why the police did not compare the disappearance of the girl and the baby to another situation, especially when the infant was left in the care of the state. Couldn't they have realized that they had the very same child in front of them? Now, 34 years later, it's hard to answer that question. Perhaps the police simply didn't know about the disappearance because the two cases were handled by two different precincts. Steve, who by then was working in a prestigious job and had a family of his own, decided to make contact with his half-sister and biological father. They were shocked when the man revealed his own disappearance. No one believed anymore that the infant might still be alive. Although we don't know what happened to Charlotte, the ending of this story can definitely be considered happy. Sad statistics tell us that the chances of finding missing children after so many years are zero. But the case of Mark Barnes was one of the rare exceptions. He grew up in a wonderful family, received a good upbringing, and became a successful man. Most likely, Charlotte was indeed suffering from a serious mental disorder. She knocked on the door of a stranger, asking for milk to feed her son. Perhaps the call to the police saved the infant's life. Who knows how Charlotte's mental state would have changed in the future. It is still unknown what happened to her, and it is unlikely that the mystery will ever be solved. Considering that she never tried to contact her husband or find her son, the woman could have died a short time after escaping from the asylum. Perhaps timely medical care could have changed the girl's condition for the better, and this whole story would have never happened. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Nicole Cable was born on August 12, 1997, in the small American town of Glenburn, Maine. Her parents divorced when she was young, and the young woman was left to live with her mother, stepfather, and 3 younger sisters. During her high school years, Nicole had a passion for music, was on the cheerleading team, and even modeled for a local company. She also had many friends who described the young woman as cheerful, helpful, and kind. She always tried to keep a positive outlook on life, even though she, like many teenagers, had her own difficulties. In the spring of 2013, when the young woman was 15 years old, she was looking forward to the approaching school vacations and her birthday. Only a few months separated her from getting the driver's license she had dreamed of for so long. Nicole lived in a tiny town where there was practically nothing but a few apartment buildings. However, about 20 kilometers away were larger communities where almost all of her friends lived, and there were many more distractions. Even her school was a 20-minute drive from home, and she had to wait for the bus every morning. On Sunday evening, May 12th, Nicole told her parents that she was going to meet a friend and would be back soon. She left the house at about 9 p.m. and headed along the main road, but she never returned home. Concerned parents tried to call her, but her phone was turned off and she hadn't logged on to social media. When they contacted her friends, they learned that none of them had seen Nicole that night. After waiting until morning, her mother decided to go to the police. She had hoped to the last that Nicole had simply stayed the night at her friend's house, even though that raised serious questions. First of all, the young woman had never left home all night without her parents' permission. Secondly, she would certainly have contacted her mother and told her where she was. The police immediately began a search. At first stages, they refused to stick to any one version. Investigators admitted that the young woman could have left home of her own free will, but they also did not rule out a criminal element. The first day of searching brought no results. Police interviewed friends and relatives of the young woman and began searching for her in the Glenburn area. Nicole's parents created a Facebook group to report their daughter missing and urged the public to help find her. That same day, her friends printed and posted hundreds of flyers, both inside and outside Glenburn. Police asked for volunteers to stay away from the area to avoid having service dogs pick up her trail. On the second day, the police held a press conference where Nicole's mother made an appeal. With tears in her eyes, she asked her daughter to return home if she ran away of her own free will. The mother also spoke out about a possible kidnapping and urged those responsible to let Nicole go if someone was holding her. The head of the local police added that the search operation would be expanded. The FBI and state police became involved, bringing the total number of officers involved to 45. The public soon learned one disturbing fact. Nicole's mother revealed that her daughter had been texting with a certain guy on Facebook for weeks. Police accessed Nicole's account and discovered that this young man was Brian Butterfield. Moreover, based on the correspondence on the day of her disappearance, the young woman had arranged to meet him at the edge of the street where her house was located. At first, the police declined to comment on the situation, but new details soon emerged. It turned out that Brian had gone to the same school as Nicole and knew her personally. But during the questioning, the guy claimed he had only spoken to the young woman a few times in his life and had never corresponded with her on Facebook. Against this backdrop, another oddity was noticed. There were two Brian Butterfield Facebook accounts. Only one of them was deleted the night Nicole disappeared. Brian himself stated that he only had one account and had nothing to do with his second account. Furthermore, he was aware of the existence of this fake page and had even complained to the police a few weeks before Nicole disappeared. It all looked really strange, and the police were in no hurry to accuse the young man of any crime. Instead, they continued to search the area around Glenburn, hoping to find some evidence. At the same time, the computer department was taking a detailed look at this suspicious Facebook account. On Friday, May 17th, the sheriff turned to the public for information. Police were looking for a black Ford Ranger pickup truck and asked for any information about the vehicle. They clarified that the driver's involvement in the young woman's disappearance has not been determined, and it is too early to draw any conclusions. The sheriff also announced a 24-hour hotline for any tips on the case. They had to allocate a separate number as the number of calls had crossed several hundred. On the sixth day, police announced they were enlisting volunteers to search the area. They set up assembly points and put people into groups. The volunteers were to look for anything that might be relevant, and this time, the search area was greatly expanded. They extended to the two nearest towns, Bangor and Old Town. More than 500 people responded to the police call. The crowd included about 400 local residents and about 100 professional volunteers from the various counties. In addition, there were off-road vehicle and horse-drawn search parties. Given the sheer scale of the operation and the rough terrain, the authorities tried to use every resource possible. They even used aerial photography in the hope that the footage might reveal something of value to the investigation. The day after the search, exactly 1 week after Nicole's disappearance, the police issued a disappointing statement. The young woman's body was found near Old Town in a wooded area not far from Road 43. They were in no hurry to release any details, specifying only that the body was covered with branches and was discovered by a service dog. Soon it was announced that the police had a homicide case, and the next day, May 20th, they reported the arrest of a suspect. It turned out to be a 20-year-old local man named Kyle Doobie. No details were known at the time, and the public was kept in the dark for some time. The next day, he was formally charged with premeditated murder. At the same time, it turned out that at the time of his arrest, he was already in prison. The guy had been sentenced to 90 days in jail for eluding police and a motorcycle accident last year. Kyle began serving his sentence 3 days before Nicole's body was discovered, but had been on the outside until then. According to the young woman's friends, she had known Kyle for several months. The day before she disappeared, she complained to several friends that Kyle had tried to kiss her, and Nicole had to give him a serious fight to get him to stop. Nevertheless, the police so far had kept the evidence against the man a secret. It was known that he lived with his parents and a 4-year-old daughter over whom he had custody. Kyle was also dating an 18-year-old young woman named Sarah and worked for a local disability care company. His attorney asked for a closed-door preliminary hearing, and the judge granted the request. Consequently, the public and the media had no access to information about the case, and the judge's decision was criticized. Nicole's funeral was held on May 26th. Beforehand, several hundred local residents gathered and honored her memory by launching balloons into the sky. A few days after the funeral, a judge, under public pressure, lifted a public disclosure ban on the case, and some disturbing facts finally came to light. First, police were able to determine that the fake Facebook account was registered from Kyle's computer, and all subsequent sessions were conducted from his IP address. This meant that it was Kyle who had tricked her out of the house shortly before the murder, and it was clear from the medical examiner's report that the young woman had died on the very day of her disappearance. Second, the police had several important witnesses at once: Kyle's own brother and his girlfriend. According to Sarah, whom the suspect was dating, Kyle confessed to her about the murder a few days after it happened. This happened immediately after Sarah was called in for questioning. There it became clear to her that the police had suspicions about Kyle, but there was no evidence. He was also questioned but stated that he was at work the day the young woman disappeared. Kyle told his brother that he lured Nicole to the outskirts of town using a fake Facebook account. The guy planned to make it look like Brian Butterfield had kidnapped her and was holding her in a remote location. Next, Kyle planned to find her and set her free, which he thought would make the young woman fall in love with her savior. It all sounds strange to say the least, but there is more to come. Remember only that this is the perpetrator's own version, told to his brother. Further events unfolded as follows. From a fake account, Kyle lured Nicole to a remote location along Hudson Road. There he was already waiting for her, lurking in the bushes. He was wearing a ski hat covering his face. When Nicole arrived at the appointed spot, he pounced on her, wrapped tape around her head, and loaded her into his father's pickup truck, a black Ford Ranger. The car was parked nearby. Next, in his own words, Kyle drove her away from the abduction site. As he began to pull her out of the car, he noticed that the young woman showed no signs of life. The guy realized that the duct tape made it impossible for her to breathe, and she passed away. Then he panicked and decided to hide the body. To his girlfriend, Kyle told the same story, adding some details. He said that before he hid the body, he took off almost all of Nicole's clothes and threw her out the car window on the way back home. This was done so that the police would not find traces of his DNA. The police did find several items of clothing that belonged to the young woman. They were in virtually the same place where Kyle had attacked Nicole. The key point here was that Kyle told his girlfriend almost exactly where he had hidden the body. It was because Sarah went to the police telling the whole story that they were able to locate Nicole's body. Kyle himself refused to admit guilt, but the situation was far from in his favor. When the police uncovered all the details of the medical examination, more serious evidence emerged against the suspect. Under Nicole's fingernails, blood was found that matched Kyle's DNA sample exactly. When the boy was questioned a few days after the murder, there were deep scratches on his face. He himself attributed it to an injury he sustained at work. Also, the cause of the young woman's death was strangulation, as evidenced by the injuries to the neck. This went against Kyle's versions of what he told his brother and the young woman. If he had taped the victim's mouth and nose, there would have been no such injuries. His lawyer requested a psychological evaluation, which caused the trial to slow down. But a few months after his arrest, something interesting happened. Kyle was charged with theft after a stolen gun was found in his home. The guy had been arrested multiple times before for robbery, but each time he got away with a fine. An examination showed Kyle to be completely sane, and a trial was set for February 2015. While awaiting trial, the defendant was in jail. Before the trial began, Kyle's attorney filed a motion to exclude certain witness statements from the case file. One of them was the correctional officer where Kyle arrived to serve a sentence for eluding police and a motorcycle accident. According to the officer, the guy was acting very nervous and even crying. When asked why he was so nervous, Kyle said something like, "It's not about the time limit, it's about what else I've done." The trial began on February 22, 2015. Kyle's lawyer stated that his client was innocent in murder and that the investigation was completely biased. According to the defense, he was at home at the time of the murder and Nicole was attacked by someone else. Kyle's girlfriend, Sarah, was named as a possible suspect. She allegedly hated Nicole because of her association with her boyfriend. The lawyer claimed that she had access to Kyle's computer, from which she could create a fake account to frame her boyfriend after the murder. This theory had no corroboration and went against the actual evidence. Kyle logged into the fake account not only from his computer, but also from his phone. What's more, he logged in through one app, changing his personal account to a fake one. Because of this, it was clearly visible when he logged out to one account and immediately logged into another. Also, there was no physical evidence against Sarah, unlike Kyle. His DNA was found not only under the victim's fingernails, but also on her clothes, which the killer threw away on his way home. The next witness was the real Brian Butterfield. He stated that Kyle had long had a grudge against him because Brian had previously dated his girlfriend. In his opinion, this is what led Kyle to create a fake account with his name so that he could frame the young man if anything happened. The prosecution also provided screenshots of correspondence showing that Kyle was not only communicating with Nicole, but also with other underage young women. The next witness was a colleague of Kyle's who worked with him at a disability care company. The defendant's lawyer insisted that the scratches on Kyle's face appeared while he was working, but the witness denied this. According to his story, on May 11 and 12, he and Kyle were at the home of a woman suffering from mental illness. At one time, she became aggressive and attacked Kyle, leaving several scratches on his face near his eye. Kyle went to the hospital for help, only to notice the next day, May 13, a coworker noticed new scars on his face. This happened right after Nicole disappeared. Another coworker said that the day Nicole disappeared, Kyle left work at about 9 p.m. and did not return until 6 a.m., even though he was supposed to be on duty all night. At the same time, he asked that he not tell anyone about his absence. The court also summoned 4 inmates with whom Kyle had interacted while in jail, awaiting trial. They all said that Kyle had confessed to them about killing the young woman. To one of them, he told them he had strangled his girlfriend and made it look like an accident. To the other, he openly stated that he'd originally planned to commit the crime. Even more interesting was the testimony of an inmate named Scott Ford. He had spent most of his life behind bars and had a reputation for being well-versed in the legal system. Kyle had been in contact with him for a long time, after which he decided to inquire about the best way for for him to get away with his crime. Next, Kyle wrote several versions on paper of what had happened in Nicole and handed the pieces of paper with this information to Ford. All of these versions had one thing in common. Kyle admitted that he had created a fake account and lured Nicole to a deserted area, but he went on to describe different versions of events. First, he wrote that he had just wanted to kidnap her and then rescue her, but he didn't settle for duct tape and the young woman suffocated. On another sheet, he said that he had jumped Nicole out of the bushes and she fainted from fright. Panicked, Kyle duct taped her mouth shut and drove her away from town, after which he noticed she had no pulse. Another version was that he didn't use the duct tape and the young woman died for nothing. Another version said that Kyle jumped out of the bushes and grabbed her torso, but then realized that he had actually squeezed her throat, after which he lost consciousness. As we can see, all of these stories seem downright delusional, but there was something really useful in them for the investigation. Kyle described in detail the place where he attacked her and where and how he hid the body. Moreover, he specified the exact location where he had hidden the ski mask in which he had attacked the young woman. All this information was kept secret until the beginning of the trial, so only the killer could know such details. Experts examined the sheets and found fingerprints and Kyle's DNA on them. The trial was not without its difficulties. Kyle's younger brother, who had testified against him 2 years earlier, began to deny the fact that Kyle had confessed to the murder. The problem was that the brother had written down all the details of what had happened in great detail, which he could only have learned from Kyle. The only one who didn't utter a word during the entire trial was Kyle himself. He refused to testify even in his own defense. The investigation offered him a deal in which he could expect a reduced sentence in exchange for a confession, but he refused. On March 6, 2016, the final court hearing was held at which the verdict was handed down. Kyle was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Nicole. His relatives and attorney tried to get a lenient sentence, citing his age and having a young daughter, but the court refused to make concessions. Kyle received 60 years for murder and another 30 for kidnapping. In closing arguments, the judge noted that the evidence against Kyle was overwhelming and his guilt in the case was clear. Instead of showing remorse and confessing, he made up various versions of what happened and tried his best to avoid prison. For this reason, the court refused to commute his sentence. Moreover, the judge was inclined to believe that Kyle had originally planned to kill Nicole, a plan he had been working on for weeks. Nicole's parents called the sentence fair and expressed a hope that he would never get out of prison again. They also gave numerous interviews and appeared on various television shows talking about the dangers of social media, using their daughter's murder as an example. In their opinion, the tragedy could have been avoided if the perpetrator had not had the opportunity to impersonate another person online. However, people like Kyle, sooner or later, can get to the point of murder even without fake accounts.
Missy Grubal was born April 26, 1974, in the American city of Burleson, Texas. Her family lived very modestly, so in her school years she got various part-time jobs to pay for her own college education. In addition, she received good grades and was an active participant in the life of the local church. Even before her graduation, Missy decided that she wanted to become a teacher, and in 1992, she went to the University of Texas at Arlington. It was about 40 kilometers from her home, and Missy decided to rent a place closer to campus. What's more, she took 2 jobs to pay her rent and tuition without the help of her parents. But sometimes even that wasn't enough to cover all her expenses. Once, she had to skip an entire semester to earn more money during that time to continue her studies. Sometimes she also worked part-time as a nurse, taking care of children. Despite such a busy schedule, Missy called her mother every day when she got home. It became something of a tradition for them. Her daughter would call her and tell her that she had returned from work, even if it was already nighttime. On the evening of April 7, 1994, Missy also called her mother. They talked until about midnight. The young woman was in good spirits and preparing to celebrate her 20th birthday, which was only a few weeks away. Around 3 a.m., the local police department received a call from Missy's neighbor who lived downstairs. She reported that there was a loud noise coming from the apartment upstairs, like broken glass and banging. She thought there might have been a robbery going on and decided to call the police. The squad arrived on the scene, and a few minutes later, the fire department received a call to the same address. It turned out that there was a fire in the house, so in addition to firefighters and police officers, an ambulance also arrived there. Upon arrival, firefighters evacuated the residence and proceeded to extinguish the fire. Given the building was small, they quickly managed to find the seat of the fire. It was the apartment on the second floor where Missy lived. When they entered the apartment, they saw a terrible sight. There was a young woman lying on the bed without any clothes on, and the fire was burning all around her. The firefighters immediately realized she was dead, so as soon as the fire was extinguished, the police arrived. They determined from the first second that the young woman had not died from the fire. They noticed several stab wounds on her body, which caused a lot of blood on the bed. As for the fire itself, firefighters immediately opined that it was purposeful arson. Moreover, when they first arrived at her apartment, they smelled a strong odor of gasoline. After examining the apartment more thoroughly, the firefighters were conclusively convinced that they were dealing with arson. Someone had poured gasoline all over the apartment and left, leaving the dead young woman inside. However, the perpetrator had closed the front door, which made the extent of the fire not as large. There was not enough oxygen in the apartment to keep the flames burning. The police quickly identified the deceased as Missy Grubaugh. In the meantime, her body was handed over to medical examiners, and they conclusively confirmed that the young woman had died before the fire started. This was confirmed by the stab wounds on her body and the lack of smoke traces in her lungs. If the victim had been alive when the fire started, even when she was unconscious, she would have inhaled smoke and the experts would have noticed it. They also determined that the young woman had been abused and were able to extract a sample of the perpetrator's DNA because of it. The police found a knife in Missy's apartment, which they believed was the murder weapon. Unfortunately, no prints were left on it. Apparently, the killer had washed it in the sink before setting the fire. Nor could the DNA sample from the victim's body help them get a lead on a suspect. In 1994, there was no way yet to load that data into the database to match the DNA of previous convictions, but the police had their first lead almost immediately. It turned out that a week before her death, Missy had filed a police report on a co-worker she had worked with at the coffee shop. A young guy had lost his place and was looking for someone to stay with for a while until he could find a new apartment. Of all his co-workers, Missy was the only one who agreed to help and let him stay with her. She even gave him a spare set of keys so he could leave and return regardless of her. The co-worker only lived there for a few days. One day, Missy came home from work and was about to put the tips she had received for the day into the piggy bank. She kept saving small amounts to add to her tuition and rent, and by then she had almost $1,000 in her piggy bank. But that day, the young woman discovered that all her money had disappeared. She immediately blamed her coworker, since no one but him had spare keys. He denied guilt, but Missy threw him out and reported him to the police. But when they started looking for him, the guy had quit his job and disappeared. So the investigators had a pretty good suspect. The guy had keys to Missy's apartment, so he had no problem getting in. When he found out the young woman had gone to the police, he might have held a grudge against her and decided to get revenge. If he didn't know that Missy had already gone to the police, he might kill her just to keep her from doing it. While the cops were searching for this guy, they started working on another clue. Letters from a certain young man had been found in the victim's apartment, and, judging by their contents, he and Missy were having some sort of affair. They didn't live very far apart, but they exchanged letters regularly. The young woman was a deep believer and had never had a boyfriend before. She also mentioned in her letters that she wasn't ready for any kind of intimate relationship until after marriage, and her companion was of the same opinion at first. But over time, the contents of his letters became increasingly intimate, and Missy wasn't happy about it. The detectives decided to run the man through the database and, to their surprise, discovered that he had a prior conviction for violent acts. Given that Missy had also been abused before the murder, this was enough to make the young man a suspect.
He was found and questioned, but he denied any involvement, but he had no solid alibi. The boy said he was sleeping alone in his house at the time of the murder. However, Missy was killed between midnight and 3 a.m., so his alibi didn't seem all that dubious. But the detectives were in no hurry to drop the charges and asked him to volunteer a DNA sample. The guy agreed and they let him go. Unfortunately, in those years, DNA analysis took more than a month, and it had only been a few days since Missy's murder, so detectives had to wait at least a month for experts to isolate the DNA profile from the victim's body, and then wait another month to compare it to the guy's sample. So investigators began looking for other leads, and soon they had a third suspect. The management of the cafe where Missy worked told them about an incident that had happened shortly before her death. The young woman complained to the manager that one of her coworkers, named Jeff, had stolen some items or money from the cash register. The theft charges were confirmed and the man was fired. Afterwards, he caught up with Missy and began accusing her of losing his job and leaving him without a livelihood. During this conversation, he said he was going to kill her. The police also discovered that Jeff had tried to win Missy's affections, but she rejected him. This also may have served as an additional motive. All this was more than enough for the police to question the man. But while the detectives were trying to find out his address, something unexpected happened. Jeff's girlfriend came into the station and said she was afraid of her boyfriend and suspected him of killing Missy. It turned out that the man had not been home the night of the murder, and he had never told his girlfriend where he was since then. She also said that Jeff had a very bad temper and often exhibited outbursts of aggression. The man repeatedly mentioned the story that he had been fired because of a complaint from Missy, and he had been furious about what she had done. When he did get found and brought in for questioning, he acted very brazen. Jeff kept smiling and bombarded the detectives with various stories that were odds with reality. He claimed that in fact Missy was obsessed with him and wanted to date him, and that was why his girlfriend had gone to the police to get revenge. He also stated that he was at home with his girlfriend the night of the murder, which contradicted her story. When the detective said that his girlfriend denied this alibi, he just laughed. That said, Jeff did agree to provide his DNA sample voluntarily. Given that there was no evidence against him and the DNA analysis could have taken over a month, he had to be released. But a few days later, Jeff's girlfriend called the police. She was extremely disturbed and told them that the guy had kidnapped her from her parents' house and held her hostage for 8 hours, threatening to kill her if she tried to get away from him. Eventually, he let her go, and the young woman immediately contacted the police. They immediately began to search for Jeff, but by then he had already escaped. In spite of this, the detectives were almost certain that he was behind Missy's murder. They put out a search for him on a kidnapping charge, but the man seemed to have vanished. Meanwhile, experts at the lab were able to determine the blood type of the owner of the DNA sample found on the victim's body. They also had samples from Jeff and Missy's boyfriend, and both had a different blood type. This came as a surprise to the detectives. They were almost certain that Jeff was the killer, but the data from the lab disproved that theory. Thus, they were left with only one suspect who had not given his DNA sample and who had not yet been found, a colleague of the victim who she had allowed to stay with her. However, a month had passed since the murder, and the police were still unable to track him down. But suddenly, they had a new lead no one was expecting. Missy's mother called the investigators and said she remembered a strange detail the young woman had told her on the phone a few days before she died. She didn't give it much thought and didn't decide to share it with the police until a month later. As mentioned earlier, Missy sometimes worked as a nanny, and one of her regular clients was a young couple who lived in the same complex. They had a young child, and the woman was pregnant with her second. Her partner, Luis Arroyo, also worked in the same restaurant as Missy, so they often saw each other and talked. According to the mother's story, a few days before her daughter's death, the man came to Missy's house to talk. Even though it was getting close to nightfall, she let him in. Luis told her that his relationship with the young woman had been strained lately and that he just needed someone to talk to. But what followed was something that struck the police as extremely strange. Missy told her mother that after the conversation, they got into a mock pillow fight. It was hard for detectives to imagine a 32-year-old man and father coming to a 19-year-old young woman's house near midnight and then having a pillow fight. But according to Missy's story, that's exactly what happened. In a conversation with her mother, she didn't give it much thought, but the police decided to check on the man. They found out that Lewis had no criminal history, had served in the army, and was a model employee at the restaurant. But after talking to his coworkers, the detectives learned a very interesting fact. Of course, after Missy's murder, the restaurant employees were constantly discussing the subject, and one day Lewis said, "I hope they catch whoever killed and raped Missy as soon as possible." A little later, he added that they might never find the culprit because all the evidence was burned in the fire. The problem was this: the police never disclosed that the victim had been abused before she died. It wasn't in the newspapers or reports. It wasn't even reported to her mother. So the detectives had a logical question. How did Lewis know about it? When questioned, the man stated that he and Missy did talk a lot, but that he had nothing to do with her murder. He was calm and forthright in answering all of the police questions until the detectives asked him for a DNA sample, at which point Lewis became visibly nervous. He asked why they needed his DNA, since the fire was supposed to destroy all traces of the perpetrator and his sample would have nothing to compare it to. You have to agree, that sounds pretty strange. It is worth noting that the police also did not disclose the fact that the experts received a sample of the killer's DNA. Therefore, no one knew whether they had this evidence or not. After these words, the detectives explained to Lewis that they had a sample of the killer's DNA, and the man's behavior changed dramatically. He said he urgently needed to take his child somewhere and left the station, promising to come back the next day to take the DNA test, but he never came. A day later, the police went to his workplace, but the man was no longer there. The manager said his girlfriend called and asked to give Lewis a couple of days off because he had to leave town. Along with this, the detectives discovered another interesting fact. Lewis had married his girlfriend the day after he was questioned. At this point, they could only guess what was behind the move. But first, the investigators decided to talk to his wife. She said that on the day of the murder, Lewis called her from work and said he was going to a bar with friends. He came home around midnight, took a shower, and said he was going for a run. He returned after 2 a.m., and his wife noticed that he smelled strongly of smoke and gasoline. The man was also coughing constantly, and his nose had traces of soot in it. His wife asked him what had happened. Lewis then told her that he had run by Missy's house and noticed the fire. He went up to her apartment and saw that the place was engulfed in flames, and the young woman herself was lying on the bed. Lewis tried to save her by giving her artificial respiration, but the smoke and flames forced him to run outside. Apparently, his wife was quite satisfied with the story, and they went to bed. As you have already realized, the detectives found a number of suspicious points in the story. Even setting aside the fact that the man decided to go for a run in the middle of the night, his further story defies any logic. First, how could he have gotten into Missy's apartment without keys? After the fire, forensics determined that there were no signs of forced entry on the door. This means that Missy let her killer in on her own, and according to Lewis's story, he entered her apartment when she was already dead. Second, if his story is to be believed, he had just seen a dead young woman he had known for a year and a full-blown fire in the house next door, but instead of calling the fire department and the police, he decided to just go to bed. His wife apparently didn't see fit to do anything about the situation either. The police also learned Lewis's blood type from his wife. It matched the blood type found on the victim's body. All of the above was enough to put a man on the wanted list, but his whereabouts remained unknown. The wife also asserted that she didn't know where her husband had gone, but the detectives didn't believe her. By then, they suspected that the woman was deliberately covering for Lewis. In their opinion, he had told her a greatly altered story about the murder in which he had no choice, or Missy had attacked him herself. In other words, he had convinced her under some false pretenses not to cooperate with the police. But everything changed when the detectives told the woman that Missy had been abused before she died. Almost immediately thereafter, Lewis's wife told them where he might be. At about the same time, police officers from the city of San Antonio found a burnt-out car that belonged to Lewis and that his mother lived in the same city. Detectives went there and found the man himself, after which he was arrested. At the station, he acted extremely tense, lying on the floor, crying, and generally looking like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But during his interrogation, Lewis stated that he had indeed gone to Missy's apartment that night and had been intimate with her in a consensual manner. This account did not go well with the fact that the young woman's body was found with many wounds and bruises, not to mention the fire. Next, Lewis's story became frankly bizarre. He said he didn't remember how events unfolded after that, but he may have stabbed her while denying that he had set the apartment on fire. The man did not actually deny his involvement in the murder, but he did not confess either. This made the detectives' job difficult, but now they could take a sample of his DNA. At that point, they already knew that Lewis's blood type matched the killer's, and all they had to do was wait for the DNA results. Sometime later, the experts found a perfect match, and Lewis was charged with murder. Given that he did not actually confess directly, the case went to trial. The man continued to insist that he and Missy had a consensual intimate relationship that night. As for the murder, he continued to give some vague version. Lewis supposedly had no recollection of stabbing her, but did seem to recall taking a knife from the kitchen. He said the same thing about the fire. He remembered that there was a fire in the room, but he did not start it himself. According to the investigation, Lewis had long had a liking for Missy and in some ways was even obsessed with her. In favor of this one interesting fact, the man had worked in the same restaurant as Missy for almost a year, and he had moved into her compound 6 months before the murder. Considering that there were hundreds of similar complexes in their city, it would be logical to assume that Lewis had chosen this particular place for the sake of living closer to Missy. In addition, in the days before the murder, he had visited her around midnight for no meaningful reason, which also seemed odd to the investigators. According to their version, on the night of the murder, Lewis had gone to her apartment for the purpose of inducing Missy to have intimate contact. The young woman, who was a virgin at the time and was saving herself for marriage, rebuffed him, and Lewis flew into a rage. He abused her, then killed her, and went to get gasoline. After setting the apartment on fire, he returned home and told his wife some made-up story in which he made up what had happened as an accident. Perhaps the story about the run and the attempt to save Missy came about only after investigators began to suspect Lewis and informed him that the fire had not destroyed the killer's DNA. Upon learning this, Lewis could have convinced his wife to tell the police how he had tried to save the young woman with CPR. Apparently, his wife really didn't know the truth. She was also not charged in any way. Detectives speculated that Lewis had married her, only that she would be legally entitled not to testify against him. As for Lewis himself, the court sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of petitioning for parole in 2034. Apparently, he had hoped for a reduced sentence, recounting his memory loss that night and not directly denying that he could have killed Missy. But the court concluded that he had long sought to seduce the young woman and eventually decided to commit the crime, after which he saw only one way out: to kill Missy to avoid prison. Thus, the police were able to solve a very complicated case in which, of the 4 suspects, the most unobvious was the culprit. They only drew attention to him thanks to Missy's mother, who decided to share a strange but insignificant detail. Perhaps Lewis would have gotten away with it if it weren't for that little detail. And lastly, as for Jeff, he was found after all and jailed for 4 years for kidnapping his own girlfriend. Jonna Berry was born on October 26, 1983, in the small American town of Bristol, Tennessee. She was lively and sociable, had many friends, and was always the life of the party. During her school years, she was also part of the local cheerleading team. After high school, Jana enrolled at East Tennessee State University, where she studied psychology and criminalistics. While studying, she also worked part-time at a children's educational center. During her time at university, she met a guy named Jason White. They dated for several years, and shortly before graduation, they got engaged. In late 2004, when Jana was 21 years old, she decided to pursue a master's degree in psychology, which required her to temporarily move to Knoxville to study at a different university. After working at the Children's Center, she realized her passion for this field and aspired to become a child psychologist. Meanwhile, her boyfriend continued his studies in another state, aiming to obtain a law degree. Despite the distance, the couple communicated every day and started preparing for their wedding, which was only a few months away. In Knoxville, Jana planned to find her own accommodation, but for the first few weeks, she stayed at her friend Jason Amami's apartment. He had studied with her and her boyfriend at the university, and after graduating, he moved to Knoxville. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and agreed to host his friend until she found a place of her own. Jana found 2 part-time jobs at a jewelry store and a children's hospital. On the evening of December 5th, after finishing her shift at the store, she went to the shopping center to buy Christmas presents. When she returned home, she packed some gifts intended for the children at the educational center, chatted with her apartment neighbor, and went to her room. There, she talked to her boyfriend on the phone and went to sleep. Around 4 a.m., Jason Amami woke up to a woman's scream. He thought Jana had a nightmare and headed to her room. At that moment, a man emerged from the room, and Jason noticed a knife in his hand. The assailant immediately attacked him and delivered several blows. The young man tried to defend himself and at some point managed to fend off the attacker, pushing him away, and ran out of the apartment. Jason quickly ran to the neighboring residential complex and began knocking on every door, hoping that someone would call the police, but no one opened for him. He then sprinted to the nearest 24-hour store, which was almost a kilometer away. Upon seeing the bloodied man, the store clerk immediately called 911, and Jason recounted what happened. The police arrived at his home and immediately discovered Jana lying on the floor next to the corridor door that connected 5 apartments. The young woman was alive, but barely responsive to what was happening around her. As the paramedics prepared to load her into the ambulance, a police officer asked, "Is the attacker still in the apartment?" And he thought he saw Jana nod ever so slightly. The officers thoroughly searched the entire building and the surrounding area, but failed to find him. The young woman was swiftly transported to the nearest hospital, but despite the efforts of the doctors, they were unable to save her. Medical experts determined that she had sustained over 20 knife wounds, leaving the doctors with virtually no chance of saving her life. As for her neighbor, the assailant had managed to inflict 8 wounds on him, with only 1 being serious. The medics provided him with the necessary care, and his life was not in danger. Meanwhile, detectives began investigating the crime scene. From the bloodstains in the corridor, they deduced that the young woman had attempted to reach out to her neighbors and seek help, but none of the 4 residents had opened their doors. Next to the door to Jana's room, investigators found the murder weapon, a kitchen knife belonging to Jason. The assailant had struck with such force that the blade had bent. In addition, the police discovered blood traces near the back door of the apartment and on the staircase leading from the 2nd floor to the street. Considering that Jason and Jana had exited through the front door, the detectives made the most obvious conclusion. The murderer had left the crime scene through the back door. Another lead awaited them in Jason's room. They found a partial footprint, which the perpetrator may have left when following the apartment owner and launching the attack. Considering the brutality with which the killer had dealt with the young woman, the police suspected that the crime was personal in nature. Their first step was to closely scrutinize Jana's fiancé, despite him being approximately 1,000 kilometers away from Knoxville. All friends and relatives attested to the couple having a wonderful relationship, and there seemed to be no motive for the fiancé to commit such a heinous crime. The young man only learned about his fiancée's death at 10 a.m. when her mother called him. He said that after hearing the news, he fainted and took a long time to recover. He had to ask his neighbor to book a plane ticket for him and pack his suitcase since he was incapable of doing anything himself. Detectives thoroughly examined his alibi and concluded that he physically couldn't have traveled to Knoxville and returned by morning. As a result, he was eliminated as a suspect, and the investigators turned their attention to Jonah's neighbor. Unlike the victim's fiancé, the neighbor had no alibi. Jason was in the same apartment as her and could have committed the crime. Friends and relatives of Jonah were also suspicious of him, with some considering him the most likely killer. Others accused him of fleeing the apartment and leaving the young woman alone, leading the victim's parents to not even want him to attend her funeral. Immediately after Jason was discharged from the hospital, the detectives began interrogating him. The young man stuck to his initial version of events. He woke up to a scream, saw an unknown man, and was attacked when he managed to push the assailant away. Jason rushed to the front door and ran outside, attempting to reach the neighbors. He believed that Jana had also managed to leave the apartment since he no longer heard her screams. However, the police were hesitant to believe this account. The first thing that made them suspect Jason was his injuries. 7 out of the 8 wounds proved to be non-life-threatening, and the last one, on his right hand, could have been sustained during both defense and attack. Furthermore, forensic experts found no signs of forced entry in the apartment, indicating that the perpetrator was already inside. Jason himself mentioned that he had taken out the trash through the back door that evening, but couldn't remember if he had locked it or not. Detectives continued to press him, paying particular attention to the door he used to run out onto the street. Jason insisted that it was the front door, but the police suspected he was lying. If he had exited through the back door, it would explain the bloody traces near the door on the stairs. In that case, it would further implicate him. Additionally, the police accused him of using and selling illicit substances and behaving aggressively when unable to obtain a dose. Jason denied all of these allegations, but the investigators kept bombarding him with various accusations. After spending several hours with Jason at the police station, the detectives offered him a polygraph test, and he agreed. They brought in an expert who asked leading questions, and at the end of the interview, informed him that the polygraph indicated that he had given false answers. Upon hearing this, Jason entered a state of close to hysteria. He screamed that he had nothing to do with the crime and feared for his life, as the real perpetrator was still at large. However, the detectives didn't believe him. Nevertheless, they couldn't arrest him for murder since there was no evidence against Jason. They had to wait for the laboratory experts to finish examining the few pieces of evidence found in the apartment. Then, an unexpected turn of events occurred. On the knife used as the murder weapon, 3 DNA samples were found, those of the deceased young woman, Jason, and an unknown male. The unknown male's DNA was also discovered in Jonah's room, on the back door handle, and on the staircase used by the perpetrator to flee. Furthermore, a fingerprint left by the victim's blood was found on the knife handle, and it didn't match Jason's fingerprint. These discoveries made the police doubt that he was the killer. The evidence confirmed that someone else was indeed present in the apartment that night, but comparing the DNA samples to existing databases yielded no results. Despite the detectives no longer considering Jason as the murderer, public opinion remained against him. He was accused of fleeing and abandoning his girlfriend instead of trying to protect her. In addition to that, Jason began to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Soon, another interesting fact emerged. It turned out that the polygraph operator had simply misinterpreted the instrument's readings. In reality, there were no signs indicating that Jason was lying. Furthermore, the police had no actual evidence linking the young man to illicit substances. They accused him of it solely to exert additional pressure. Most importantly, the police initially downplayed the severity of the injuries Jason sustained. In reality, he had suffered serious harm, with his lung and neck being severely damaged. Full recovery was unlikely. Due to these police reports, the insurance company only covered 25% of the medical expenses, and Jason experienced significant financial difficulties. After he ceased being a suspect, the police began questioning Jason as a witness. Based on his statements, they created an approximate profile of the attacker. The situation was complicated by the fact that Jason couldn't clearly see the assailant's face, as the room was dark, and the perpetrator immediately attacked him when he exited the room. Detectives also discovered something interesting in Jonah's room: a cap, and near the back staircase there were scattered discs and a stereo player. Initially, they assumed these items belonged to the victim or Jason, but Jason denied it. According to him, none of those belongings were in his apartment, implying that the killer left them behind. The investigators handed the approximate portrait of the suspect to journalists, and after its publication in the news, the police received hundreds of potential leads. People provided information about acquaintances who even remotely resembled the portrait, and the detectives followed up on each lead. One of them seemed particularly intriguing to a detective. They were informed that in the vicinity of Jonah's murder, there was a group of teenagers known for breaking into houses to commit theft. One of them, a 19-year-old named Michael Perkefell, resembled the suspect's portrait, and the police began searching for him. It wasn't easy since the young man was already wanted for theft. However, now that he was suspected of potential involvement in the murder, dozens of police officers joined the search. They eventually located him and brought him to the station. The investigators immediately noticed his footwear. The pattern on the soles resembled the footprint left by the killer. They collected a DNA sample and fingerprints from him and sent everything to the experts. Meanwhile, they interrogated him, and during the questioning, the detectives were in for an unexpected surprise. Michael confessed almost immediately that he and his friend had indeed broken into Jonah's apartment that night. According to Michael's account, their intention was to steal valuable items from Jonah's apartment, but his friend grabbed a knife and attacked her. However, the detectives quickly became skeptical of his story. Firstly, the details Michael provided didn't match the actual facts. And secondly, there were no traces of the presence of two outsiders at the crime scene. The laboratory result only confirmed their skepticism. Michael's DNA and fingerprints did not match those found at the murder scene. The same applied to his shoes. The pattern on the soles was different from the footprint in Jason's room. Eventually, the police realized that the young man was simply lying. As strange as it may sound, such situations occur quite often. Many high-profile cases involve individuals who take on someone else's guilt. Some do it to seek attention, while others lie in hopes of receiving rewards for information. It's unknown what motives drove Michael, but his story turned out to be fabricated. Since then, investigators have interviewed over 1,000 potential suspects and collected around 400 DNA samples, but they haven't found a single match. From the early weeks of the investigation, a reward was announced for information leading to the resolution of the case. The amount increased each month and reached $60,000 in December of 2005, 1 year after the murder. The state governor added $20,000 from his own pocket, which further drew public attention. Despite the numerous leads, all of them proved to be dead ends, and the case remained unresolved for several years. In 2007, the victim's parents decided to advocate for changes in the state's legislation. They found it astonishing that the perpetrator's fingerprints and DNA were not found in any of the databases, considering the brutality of the crime. The parents refused to believe that it was his first offense. Later, they learned that under the laws of Tennessee, fingerprints and DNA samples were only taken from convicted criminals. Jana's parents resolved to rectify this situation and participated in the creation of a new law that mandated the collection of these samples from all individuals arrested for violent crimes. The authorities supported this initiative, and in May of 2007, such a law was enacted. 2 months later, a breakthrough finally occurred in the case. The police arrested 22-year-old Taylor Lee Olson for violating the terms of his parole. The man had been convicted of theft, and during a search of his home, marijuana bushes were discovered, leading to his rearrest. Olson had an extensive criminal history, primarily consisting of thefts, check forgery, and car thefts. He had been arrested multiple times, but his fingerprints and DNA were never taken until now. Despite living with his girlfriend and their newborn daughter, Olson regularly committed crimes. It turned out that Olson had already come to the attention of investigators 5 months prior. They received a tip about his possible involvement in the murder, but for some reason, the police never attempted to take his DNA for analysis. However, now that he was arrested for violating the terms of his parole, they finally decided to question him about the Jonah case. Olson denied his involvement in the murder and willingly agreed to provide his DNA sample. It was handed over to experts, and soon the detectives received a report from the laboratory. Taylor's DNA fully matched the sample found in the victim's apartment. Following this, his fingerprints were taken, and they also matched the print found on the murder weapon. Olson was subsequently arrested, and the detectives brought him in for questioning. At first, he denied his guilt, but soon he decided to confess. Taylor explained that on that night he wanted to steal Jonah's car and entered the apartment through the back door to take the keys. When he entered the young woman's room, she woke up and started screaming. That's when Olson grabbed a kitchen knife and struck her multiple times, although he claimed he did not intend to kill anyone and it all happened accidentally. The detectives doubted the truthfulness of some aspects of his account and leaned toward the belief that Taylor had initially planned the murder. It was possible that he had been stalking the victim for some time, indirectly supported by a fact mentioned earlier in the investigation. Jana's friends told investigators that she had been followed by someone in a car. At the time, they couldn't find any evidence to confirm it, but after Olson's arrest, they considered the possibility that he had indeed been stalking her. Despite the doubts surrounding some details, nobody questioned Olson's guilt. His DNA and fingerprint were found on the murder weapon, indicating that he had inflicted the knife wounds on the victim. Olson's trial was scheduled to begin in mid-2008, and by that time, he had already hired a lawyer. Apparently, the lawyer advised him to retract his confession, and Taylor provided a new version of events to the detectives. Now he claimed that he had entered Jana's apartment together with his friend named Noah Cox. According to Olson, when he entered Jonah's room to take the car keys, she allegedly woke up, grabbed a knife, and struck him multiple times. Olson ran out of the apartment through the back door, while his friend went into Jonah's room, where he grabbed a knife from her and killed the young woman. This account also did not convince the police. No fingerprints or DNA of other individuals were found at the crime scene, making the involvement of someone else unlikely. The detectives were awaiting the start of the trial, but it was never meant to happen. On March 28, 2008, Taylor Olson ended his life in his prison cell. Several suicide notes addressed to his family, Jonah's relatives, and the police were found next to him. In the letter to the detectives, he once again claimed that his friend Noah Cox was the actual killer and apologized to Jonah's family and his own. The detectives continued to believe that Olson was the one who committed the murder, yet they repeatedly questioned Noah, but no evidence of his involvement could be found. Jonah's parents also believed that he lied. In their opinion, if Taylor was truly innocent, he would not have taken his own life. It was much more likely that he simply didn't want to spend his entire life in prison. Moreover, for several months after his confession, Olson continued to maintain that he entered the apartment alone and that no one was with him. If he was trying to protect his friend, why did he suddenly retract his confession and start accusing him of the murder? Haley Dodd was born on November 30th, 1981 in England. When the girl was young, her parents, along with other children, moved to Australia, settling in the small town of Mandurah. The young woman was an excellent student, played sports, and planned to go to study to be a veterinarian or a school teacher. But before finally deciding on a choice of future profession, she wanted to travel around Australia. Graduating high school in 1999, at the age of 17, she set off on a trip to Western Australia with her best friend Lisa. Their plan wasn't just to drive through local towns and attractions, but to spend a few months away from home. The young women were going to look for temporary jobs along the way to cover their living, food, and travel expenses. They planned to hitchhike between cities, which in the 1990s in Australia didn't sound like such a dangerous idea. At the time, there had been a number of murders of young women hitchhiking in the country, but compared to the overall number of people hitchhiking safely, these crimes did not cause any mass fear. However, Haley feared that her parents would not allow her to travel that way, even in the company of a friend. For this reason, she assured them that she planned to travel by bus. At the end of July, she and Lisa traveled to a town called Dhillon. There, they were going to work as day laborers on a local farm. They were staying at a camping site where they could get a place to sleep for a small fee. Such places are in high demand in Australia, mainly because of their cheapness. A few days before going to work, Haley decided to use the remaining free time and go to a farm to family friends, which was 200 kilometers away. She decided to hitchhike to it, and Lisa didn't want to let her go alone. But Haley insisted she had nothing to worry about and would be back in a few days. To say goodbye, Lisa gave her her folding knife for self-defense and some change so Haley could call her from the phone booth. After saying goodbye, she hit the road at about 8 a.m. Family friends at the farm awaited her arrival, but Haley never showed up. Worried, they called her mother and informed her. The woman feared something might have happened to her daughter, so she immediately called the police. The first thing she did was to dial an emergency number and describe the situation. After listening to her story, the operator thought that nothing urgent had happened, so she advised her to go to the local police department and file a missing person report. So she did. The detectives began their search for Haley, beginning to reconstruct the chronology of events. The first thing they did was arrive at the campsite where Lisa was staying. She was mortified at the news that her friend had never made it to the farm, but the young woman was able to give the police a comprehensive introduction. She accurately described all the clothes Haley was wearing that day and even drew a sketch of the earrings she was wearing for the police. Haley had bought these earrings a few days before the incident. She and Lisa had gone to the store to treat themselves to some inexpensive items, and the young woman was attracted to this jewelry. At that time, she couldn't have imagined that those earrings would be the key to solving this terrible mystery of her disappearance. Detectives disseminated information about the missing young woman along with her description. Although she was almost 18 years old, Haley looked much younger. She was 152 centimeters tall and weighed just over 40 pounds. The police were able to locate the first witness fairly quickly. It turned out to be the truck driver who had given her a ride that day. According to the man's story, she had knocked on his cab window at a gas station and asked for a ride to Mora, a town near where there was a farm. The trucker was on his way to another town, but he agreed to give her a ride most of the way. The man dropped her off at a turnoff about 50 kilometers from Mora, near the town of Vajangara, where she was to turn off the main road and onto a country road. According to the trucker, Haley was in high spirits, chatting with him the whole way and talking about her journey. After she said she was almost out of money, he gave her $15 so the young woman could buy something to eat. The man also left her his number in case she hitchhiked back. He made trips down that road almost every day and could have let her down again. Later, detectives received several more calls from people who had seen Haley in that area. Based on their statements, police concluded that the young woman had been on foot along the northwest road towards Mora. Apparently, she could not find any driver at the gas station to give her a ride. For this reason, she decided to walk along the road and try to hitch a ride. Based on the testimony of the next witness, he gave Haley a ride to the turnoff on Gunderdo Road, after which she headed further in her direction on foot. The next witness was a woman driving along the road. She spotted Haley just as the young woman was getting out of her car and moving on foot towards Mora. In all, the police were contacted by more than 10 witnesses. After putting their statements together, detectives concluded that the young woman was last seen at about 12 noon on the northwest road, about 50 kilometers from Mora. There was another witness, though. He had not seen Haley, but still shared a disturbing observation with police. The man pulled over on the side of the northwest road because his engine was overheating. At one point, he heard a dog barking, followed by a piercing female scream. He couldn't see the source of the sound, as it might have been far enough away. The road passed through an empty flat area where there was virtually no extraneous noise. With all this information in hand, the police's prognosis was disappointing from the start. Lead Detective Eddie Rowe decided that they should look for the body and not consider the possibility that Haley might be alive. But management forbade him to investigate in such a manner, leaving it to the status of the search for the missing person. It's worth clarifying here that a murder investigation would have given the police more options than a missing person investigation. But the police had no leads that could help them get on the young woman's trail, so they quickly set about looking for potential kidnappers. In a short time, they were able to identify several dozen suspects who lived in the area, but eventually the police focused on 3 men. One worked as a teacher at a local school, another was a part-time gardener there, and the third lived not far from where Haley disappeared. When questioned, each of them pleaded not guilty and provided alibis. The police could not conclude with certainty of their innocence, but they could not find any evidence to the contrary. But soon the situation changed dramatically. The investigators were approached by a neighbor of one of the suspects, a 43-year-old school gardener named Francis Wark. He told them that the day Haley disappeared, Francis borrowed his car to go shopping in Mora. When the man returned home around 1 p.m., a neighbor noticed damage inside the car. The turn signal knob was broken, and the dashboard also showed signs of impact. The neighbor didn't even have time to ask what happened to the car. Francis came home, dumped the shopping bags in the kitchen, got on his motorcycle, and drove off. This story seemed strange to the police, and they decided to re-interview Francis. The man said that at the time of Haley's disappearance, he was many kilometers away from the alleged place of her abduction. According to his story, after returning home, he immediately went to a party in the city of Perth on his motorcycle. But he was not supposed to get there that day. On the way there, he exceeded the speed limit and had a serious accident that took him to the hospital. The information available was enough for the detectives to ask the perfectly logical question: where was he going in such a hurry? His own testimony seemed very strange, and investigators decided to apply for a search warrant of his home. The officers searched his residence, but they were unable to find any potential evidence. They also searched the car and removed the seat covers so that experts could examine them in the lab. Unfortunately, none of this yielded any results, and Francis was left alone. Almost immediately after that, he moved to the other side of the country, to Queensland, and the detectives were left empty-handed, and the case went into a long drawer. They tried to find new witnesses and evidence to move the investigation forward, but to no avail. This went on for 8 whole years until Francis came back on the police radar in 2007. At the time, he was living in a remote outback in a small settlement. One morning, an elderly couple who lived next door to him were sitting on the porch of their house. At some point, they noticed with horror that a young woman with absolutely no clothes was running in their direction, and her head was covered with blood. She asked for help, and the residents of the house called the police. The victim said that she had tried to catch a ride the night before. A man stopped in front of her and offered her a ride. At one point, he told her he needed to go to a place to get gas and fill up his car. They drove up to a house in the middle of nowhere, and he called the woman inside and offered her some tea. Unfortunately for her, she said yes. Almost immediately thereafter, he attacked her, and after a brief struggle, tied her up. For the next few hours, the victim was subject to indescribable torture and violence. Her assailant also tore off one of her earrings and took it for himself. As you may have guessed, this man was Francis. By morning, the woman realized that she could get the rope off her hands and then free her legs and run. She loosened the rope, waited for the right moment for Francis to move as far away as possible, and rushed to the back door of the house. Before she left, she removed her pendant and tossed it under the bed. The woman feared that the police might not find any corroboration of her story, so she decided to leave some personal item in his house, and it really worked. The police searched Francis's house, found the very same pendant, and arrested the man. At the trial, he quickly realized that he could not get away with it and decided to confess to what he had done. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The police in Western Australia, who handled the Haley Dodd case, were notified of Francis's arrest, but they did not appear to be at all interested. No action was taken by the detectives to revive the 8-year-old case, which was so closely resembling the circumstances of Francis's crime. Only through the insistence of Haley's mother did the detectives agree to reopen the case, but they quickly concluded that there was still no evidence against Francis, which meant there was nothing they could do about it. All these years, Haley's family tried to get the police to investigate thoroughly, but they assured them that they had done everything in their power. Desperate to wait for help from law enforcement, the relatives spent tens of thousands of dollars on private investigators, but all to no avail. The case did not take a new turn until 6 long years later, in 2013, when an extremely outrageous fact came to light. It turned out that the police had simply forgotten about the evidence that ended up being the key to the case. The medical examiner, Tracy Horn, filed a request to reopen the investigation. The reason was that the very same car seat covers seized from Francis's neighbor's car in 1999 were found in evidence storage. Suddenly, it turned out that for 14 years, they had never been tested for blood, DNA, and other evidence. When experts did retrieve them, they were immediately able to find a woman's earring that had snagged on the fabric of the covers. Taking a drawing of Lisa's, which she drew for the police just after her friend's disappearance, detectives were horrified to see. It was the same earring that Haley was wearing the morning of her disappearance. But that wasn't all. A human hair was found on one of the car mats that had also been removed from the car. Experts extracted a DNA sample from it that showed a match to Haley Dodd's mother's DNA. That meant that the hair was very likely Haley's own, but that probability was not 100%, which made it very difficult to prosecute Frances in the shortest possible time. As soon as the news leaked to the media, a wave of criticism poured in against the police. For 14 years, this evidence lay literally under the noses of the investigators, but in all that time, they never remembered it. Of course, such a find instantly changed the course of the case, and the detectives went to the other side of the country to interrogate Francis again. At the time, he was still in prison for assaulting a woman in 2007. The man gave them the same story he had told them 14 years earlier. He denied his involvement and assured them that he was shopping in Mora at the time of Haley's abduction. The interrogation, which lasted nearly 4 hours, was inconclusive, so the police had to prepare the case to go to trial. It wasn't until 2015 when he was formally charged with Haley's murder and deported to Western Australia. 2 more years later, in late 2017, the trial began. Francis's defense insisted that all the evidence presented was circumstantial. The earring Haley bought at a local store was very cheap and popular, so it could have been left in the car by another woman. The hair found in the car showed an almost 100% match to Haley's DNA, but not an absolute exact match. Although a mistake here would have been highly unlikely, that was enough for the lawyers. But all these arguments seemed unconvincing to the judge. Perhaps Francis would still have had a chance to get away with it if not for his crime in 2007. But then he didn't just kidnap a woman who was hitchhiking, he also took her earring. The prosecution believed that the man was collecting the victim's earrings as trophies, which only increased the suspicion against him in the end. As a result, the judge found him guilty of kidnapping and murdering Haley Dodd, sentencing him to 21 years in prison. All of this took place while his previous sentence was still pending. Francis was 62 years old at the time of his sentencing, but the story did not end there. The court believed Francis kidnapped and killed Haley, then hid her body, but it was never found, and the man himself refused to plead guilty. Haley's mother repeatedly asked the killer to tell her where he hid the body, but to no avail. And in 2018, she helped pass a new law that says murderers are not eligible for parole if they refuse to reveal the location of their victims' bodies. In 2020, another high-profile event occurred. The court granted Francis appeal to overturn his sentence and scheduled a new hearing. His lawyers again tried to insist that the man would not have had time to kidnap Haley between his trip to Mora and his return home, but the court felt that the time frame allowed him well enough to do so, especially given the rush with which he arrived home and immediately set off for Perth on his motorcycle. Moreover, the earring, along with the hair, were still on the list of key evidence against him, but Francis still managed to get his sentence changed. The court found him guilty of involuntary manslaughter, reducing his sentence from 21 years to 18 years. But thanks to a law passed in 2018, he would not be able to go free even after that time if he refused to identify the location of the body. There is another point in the whole story that keeps the detectives busy to this day. They are sure that many more women have become victims of Francis and that none of them managed to escape. This maniac could have been picking up young women on the roads for decades, and what happened to them next only he knows. One of the most likely similar cases is the disappearance of a woman in late 2005. She hitchhiked to another city and was never seen again. The detective handling the case is certain that Francis kidnapped her, because he knew the victim personally, but there is no evidence at this time. Perhaps the police will find it again in their warehouse a few years later, but it won't make a difference to the perpetrator. If the police had examined the car more thoroughly, Francis would have been arrested back in 1999. Now we can only guess how many lives he ruined in the ensuing years, but sooner or later, the mystery may be solved. There's another creepy thing about this whole story. Remember that in the initial stages of the investigation, the police identified 3 main suspects, including Francis? Now, one of them killed his wife 5 months after Haley disappeared, and the other, who worked as a school teacher, turned out to be one of the worst child molesters in Australian history. Too bad the police had no way to solve them at the time. Riley Crossman was born on December 22, 2003, in the small American town of Martinsburg, West Virginia. Her parents divorced when she was young, and the girl moved with her mother and younger sister to Berkeley Springs, a town 40 kilometers from Martinsburg. After a while, her mother began dating another man, and they had 2 more children. However, Riley maintained a close relationship with her father and regularly went to visit him. The girl attended Berkeley Springs High School and took dance and singing lessons. She also had a boyfriend named Hayden Lacey. According to her parents, there was a great relationship between them. Riley was happy. She and her boyfriend even had a joint Instagram account where they posted pictures together. Her mom, Chantel Oakley, worked 2 jobs. On May 7, 2019, she took off early from her morning shift because she wasn't feeling well. When she arrived home, she texted Riley that she was going to sleep in before her evening shift and asked her to wake her up when the girl returned from school. Riley came home at about 3:30 p.m., woke up her mother, and went to her room. Chantel's roommate's mother was also in the house with her that day, effectively replacing her grandmother and looking after the younger children. Chantel returned from work at about 10 p.m. As she walked past her daughter's room, she saw that her door was closed, but the light was on behind her. Her mother thought Riley was getting ready for bed and went to bed herself almost immediately. She was still not feeling well and wanted to get a good night's sleep before her morning shift. The next day, at about 7:15 a.m., Chantel peeked into her daughter's room before she left for work, but Riley wasn't there. She didn't see anything suspicious about that, though. School started at 7:45 and the girl could have gone there already. Riley's school was only a short walk away, so she got there on her own. About halfway through the day, her mother got a call from the school saying that Riley had missed some classes. This alarmed Chantel slightly, but she still didn't see it as a major concern. Her daughter could have just skipped a few classes and gone out with friends. At about 3:30 p.m., Riley's grandmother began to worry. The girl should have been home by now, but still wasn't. Then she contacted Chantel, at which point her mother already suspected something was wrong. Riley was always calling or texting her to take time off to go out with friends after school, but that day she didn't get a single message from her daughter. Her mother had sent her several messages, and they had all failed to reach their destination. Then she tried calling her, but each time it went to voicemail. This indicated that Riley's phone was either dead or had been turned off for some reason. Chantel also called Riley's own father, hoping that the girl might have gone to him. However, he too did not contact his daughter that day. The mother asked her grandmother to go to the school and look for Riley there. The grandmother went there, but she was unable to locate the girl. None of the teachers knew where she could be either. Around 5 p.m., Chantel decided to take a day off from work and drove to the school, but she couldn't find her daughter either. She spotted her boyfriend in the parking lot and asked if he had seen Riley, but Hayden stated that he had spent the day on an out-of-town trip and had not even contacted her. Together, they went around the school grounds, looking in and around the building itself, but the girl was nowhere to be found. After a while, her mother decided to go home, hoping that Riley might have returned there. Alas, she was not there either. After waiting some more time, she decided to go to the police. By then, the girl's father had arrived in Berkeley Springs and went in search of his daughter. He drove around the small town asking people he met if they had seen Riley. With a population of just over 600, most of the residents knew each other. One of the local teenagers said he saw her walking down the street. Unfortunately, this information did nothing to help him find Riley, and investigators thought the boy was just mistaken. The police quickly began a search, interviewing everyone the girl knew. None of her friends had seen Riley that day, nor had she shown up at school. At the same time, several teachers noted that she was present in their classes. This misled the detectives at first, but it soon became clear. These teachers had simply failed to notice the girl's absence and flagged her down. From conversations with Riley's acquaintances, the police began to reconstruct the chronology of events. They found out that on the evening of May 7th, the girl was on the phone with her boyfriend until 10:30 p.m., and she answered her friend's messages on social media until midnight. What follows is something very strange. At 5:40 a.m., Riley called her boyfriend by video link, but he was asleep at the time and didn't answer. The detectives immediately suspected something was wrong. Why was Riley trying to contact him at such an early hour? The girl's mother assured her that Riley would never run away from home. She simply had no reason to. Given that she was the eldest child in the family, her mother treated her very gently, almost never forbade her to go out with friends or a boyfriend, allowed her to go to her father's house in another town at any time, and generally did not control her every move. The only thing was that Riley always informed her of her plans and asked permission. Considering that the girl was only 15 years old at the time of her disappearance, she had no driver's license, so she also could not leave town on her own in a car. This once again indicated that the version of an escape seemed unlikely. Instead, the detectives considered kidnapping as the most likely theory. The same evening Riley's mother contacted law enforcement, they began a search for the girl. Police officers searched the school and the surrounding area and combed the town. They were quickly joined by community volunteers who cared about Riley. As is usually the case, these small-town residents thought nothing like this could happen to them. Soon, the police decided to search Riley's bedroom, and there they found the first grisly piece of evidence. On a pillow and sheets, they found small blood stains. They sent the items immediately to a lab, where experts ran a DNA test and determined that the blood belonged to Riley. At this point, everyone realized that something truly terrible had happened to the girl. If her family had hoped to the last that Riley had gone somewhere on her own initiative, after the discovery of the blood, those hopes were dashed. Here, it's worth clarifying why the mother didn't notice traces of blood when she examined her daughter's bedroom a few hours earlier. The bed was made, and it had not occurred to her to lift the blanket. This finding not only indicated that the girl had most likely been attacked, it had all happened in her house, and it was up to the police to figure out who might have done it. After the blood trail was discovered, the search escalated. In the days that followed, more volunteers joined the police. Dozens of people also provided various equipment that might come in handy when surveying the area. At one point, detectives even had to ask the public to stop carrying the equipment because there was already an excess of it. In addition, the police repeatedly gave press conferences to get the story out to the general public. There is always a chance that someone might have noticed something strange, heard suspicious conversations, or stumbled upon potential evidence. So it was important for the police to let everyone in the county know about Riley. After a while, the local police were joined by the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the state police. Together they continued to search for the missing girl, but with no results. On May 15th, law enforcement decided to bring in additional forces and organized a large-scale search covering a wide area of many kilometers around the city. The next morning, they announced that they had managed to find Riley Crossman's body. It was about a 40-minute drive from Berkeley Springs, near a country road near the top of a small mountain. The detectives knew immediately that they were dealing with a murder, not an accident. It looked as if the unknown perpetrator was trying to hide the body as far away from prying eyes as possible. Medical examiners examined the body and confirmed that it was indeed Riley, but they couldn't determine the cause of death because of the extensive decomposition. It was very strange because it had been just over a week since the girl had disappeared. Apparently, the killer had done something to the body. Investigators noticed several other strange things. First, the girl was wearing only one shoe, and they could not find a second shoe anywhere nearby. Secondly, they concluded that the unknown perpetrator changed her clothes because they had information that the girl was supposed to be wearing leggings and a sweatshirt, while when they found her, she was wearing shorts. They also found traces of whitewash or plaster on her clothing. The police reclassified the case as a homicide, and now they had to find the perpetrator. They re-interviewed all of Riley's relatives and acquaintances and noticed something odd. The testimony of Andy McCauley, Chantel's roommate, did not match the story of another man Andy worked with at a construction site in nearby Hedgesville. He initially told police that on May 8th, Riley's birthday, he did not leave his workplace from morning until late afternoon. However, that same day, around 10 a.m., his neighbor noticed a green Dodge pickup truck in front of their house. The neighbor knew that this car did not belong to either Andy or Chantel. Moreover, Andy's driver's license had been temporarily revoked. With all this in mind, the neighbor asked Chantel what this car was doing in front of their house, but the woman was unaware. After the whole town became aware of Riley's disappearance, the neighbor decided to share the observation with the police. Detectives questioned Andy again. They determined that the vehicle in question belonged to one of his co-workers, and the man had not driven it before. The owner of the pickup truck often picked Andy up in the mornings to drive him to work. Upon learning that the police were aware of his movements that day, Andy changed his statement. He stated that he had actually taken the pickup truck and drove it to buy illegal substances to take with a co-worker at the construction site later in the day. Sometime later, he changed his statement again and said that he went to his house to pick up the substances and then returned to work. All of this already looked very strange, but the detectives had even more creepy discoveries waiting for them next. For starters, they talked to Riley's mother and asked her to recall if she had noticed any oddities in her roommate's behavior. Then she told them that on May 8th, the day her daughter disappeared, Andy had indeed been acting suspiciously. When he returned home that night, Chantel told him about Riley's disappearance. The man immediately said he would go looking for her, got on his bicycle, and rode off. However, when the woman returned home from her search, she found Andy asleep on the couch as if nothing had happened. This behavior was very strange. All of Riley's relatives had been combing the streets until late at night, helped by concerned townspeople, while Andy simply went to sleep as if nothing had happened. In addition, one day after the girl went missing, Chantel called Andy and recorded the conversation. Unfortunately, its full content was not disclosed. All we know is that Chantel was already suspicious of Andy at this point and linked it all to his addiction to illegal substances. The police then spoke to Andy's coworker and found out that, in fact, the men had been absent from work from about 9 a.m. until about 2 p.m. In addition, the coworker stated that he believed that Andy had banned substances with him to begin with, so there was no reason for him to go somewhere to get them. The detectives then searched for the green Dodge and found a large stain of dried plaster in the trunk. Forensics showed that it was the same substance found on Riley's clothing. Investigators also led service dogs of the pickup, which detected a deadly smell in the trunk. They also found some pretty specific bolts in the car, which are rarely used. 2 of the exact same bolts were found near Riley's body. The police soon found another inconsistency in Andy's statement. They examined camera footage from nearby communities and found that on May 8th, the man was only a few miles from where Riley's body would later be found. He was caught on gas station store cameras and on several traffic cameras. It was all very strange. Andy didn't have a driver's license, was usually picked up by other people, and got around on his bike. But this day, for some reason, he took someone else's car and drove it around for half a day on unfamiliar routes. Another coworker told police that on May 8, Andy asked him for 3 construction bags. Detectives were also approached by Andy's former coworker, who told an even creepier story. He said that he and Andy had never gotten along, but between about 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on May 8th, Andy called him dozens of times and also sent a whole bunch of messages. He was in a panic and said he needed to hide with someone right away. Andy explained that he was in possession of illegal substances and was afraid of being caught. This former colleague did not let him in that night, but later reported the story to the police. In his defense, the man stated that he had taken illegal substances that night, after which he noticed a police car parked not far from his house and panicked. Except the police department checked this information and found that none of their cars were in that area. This meant that Andy's story was a common lie. All of the above was enough for the police to arrest Andy the day after the body was found and charge him with murder. The man denied guilt, so the case went to trial. The case then stalled for more than 2 years as the trial did not begin until September 27, 2021. This was due to the coronavirus and the limitations associated with it, as well as the peculiarities of the U.S. court system, where such delays are the norm. Nevertheless, even more gruesome details of the case emerged during the course of the trial. For starters, Chantel, in her speech, provided one disturbing detail about the evening of May 7th. That afternoon, she returned from work at 10 p.m., and Andy was asleep on the couch. When she entered the room, the man immediately woke up. When she saw his eyes, Chantel immediately thought he had taken illegal substances. Andy had used powerful drugs before and even had a criminal record for possession, of which the woman was well aware. Further, the prosecution revealed information about disturbing messages sent from Riley's phone shortly before her disappearance. At 11 p.m. on May 7th, the girl texted her boyfriend that Andy had just gone into her room. 12 minutes later, she sent another text where she wrote that she was scared. She never contacted him again. Unfortunately, Hayden had already gone to bed at that time and did not see these messages. By morning, they had already been deleted. At trial, he also said that Andy had repeatedly entered Riley's room that night. The girl was video chatting with her boyfriend, and Hayden could hear him enter the room. Andy asked her to do the dishes and talked about some other mundane things, but Riley was unequivocally afraid of him. She asked Guy not to pass out while Andy was in her room. It also came out at trial that Andy had called Riley several times around 3 a.m., but she wouldn't pick up the phone, and on the third time, she blocked his number altogether. The whole thing was very creepy and incomprehensible. According to the prosecution's version, Andy made these calls to see if Riley was communicating with her boyfriend at the time. Later, the records of these calls were deleted from both phones, but the cell phone provider still had them. Despite all this, the prosecution had no evidence to indicate what had happened that night. They speculated that Andy killed Riley late that night, waited until morning, and drove to work. He then borrowed a coworker's car, drove to the house, picked up the body, and took it to a secluded spot. He then cleared the message and call history from her phone and got rid of it. It also emerged at trial that Chantel and Andy's own mother not only knew about his addiction to illegal substances, they also knew that under their influence, the man was becoming aggressive and dangerous. The final court hearing was held on October 5, 2021. Despite the fact that all available evidence was circumstantial and did not connect Andy directly to the murder, the jury reached a guilty verdict. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Further consideration was given to the possibility of parole. Andy's attorneys asked to give their client the option after 15 years, but the judge ultimately ruled for life without the possibility of parole. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Andy showed no emotion. He also seemed detached and uninterested at previous hearings. Apparently, he had resigned himself to the inevitable. But what about motive? Because of the degree of decomposition, the experts could not establish whether Riley had been abused. This, however, is the most obvious option. Even though the court could not prove it, this story was widely covered in the American media, and people's opinions were divided. Some put part of the blame on the girl's mother, who brought a convicted drug addict into her home and built a family with him. At the trial, she assured them that it had never even occurred to her that Andy might harm her children. Others defended the mother, believing that she could not have foreseen such an outcome. She worked 2 jobs most of the time to feed her family, and perhaps she didn't even have time to think about her decisions might affect her children. What remains unclear is the moment of that 5:30 a.m. video call made from Riley Hayden's phone. Was the girl still alive at that moment? Or did Andy make the call to throw off the investigation later? Lisa Kimmel was born July 18, 1969, in the small American town of Covington, Tennessee. Soon her parents had 2 more daughters, and in 1972, the family moved to a town called Billings. From an early age, the girl was distinguished by her independence and determination. She helped her parents take care of their younger sisters and also worked part-time at a local restaurant. Thanks to this, she earned a new Honda CRX for herself even before she graduated from high school. The young woman also finished her license plate with the inscription, "Little Miss," as she was often called by her parents and sisters, and these plates would play a significant role in the whole story. After graduating from high school in 1987, Lisa decided to continue working at the restaurant despite her parents' objections. They wanted their daughter to go to college, but the young woman planned to pursue a career in her chosen direction. They eventually agreed that Lisa would work for a year and still consider going to college. The young woman worked at a large chain restaurant, Arby's, along with her mother, who was the regional manager there. And soon after graduation, Lisa was offered a management position herself, but already in another city. She was to go to the suburbs of Denver, about 900 kilometers from home, and manage a restaurant there. For the 18-year-old young woman who had just graduated from high school, it was a serious challenge, but Lisa accepted without a shadow of a doubt. In addition, her mother frequently traveled to Denver for work, and they saw each other almost every week. Sometimes the young woman herself drove to her family's house in Billings. The restaurant where Lisa worked was in a town called Aurora. She quickly settled into her new place, rented an apartment, and was generally excited about her new life. She made new friends and a few months later started dating a guy named Ed. He often went to Aurora but lived 800 miles away. On Friday, March 25, 1988, Lisa was getting ready with anticipation for the weekend she had big plans for. She was going to go to Billings and take her boyfriend with her to finally introduce him to her family. He lived in Cody, Wyoming, which was along her route. Lisa planned to pick him up and drive on with him from there. She left Aurora at about 4 p.m. She had about 7 hours to drive to the boyfriend's house. After driving about 400 kilometers, Lisa reached Douglas, Wyoming. Apparently, she was in a big hurry because at 9 p.m. a police officer stopped her car for speeding. According to his radar readings, Lisa was going about 140 kilometers per hour. He gave her a $120 fine, which state law required her to give to the officer on the spot. Lisa didn't have that amount with her, so the police officer suggested she withdraw the money from the nearest ATM near the road. They got there, but the terminal did not support Lisa's bank card. According to the rules, the police officer had to detain the offender, who was unable to pay the fine. But the man agreed to let Lisa go on the condition that she send the check to the local police department. The young woman got into her car and drove on. It was about a 4-hour drive from Douglas to her boyfriend's house. Woman, he never waited for her that night, and toward morning, Ed fell asleep. When he woke up at about 7 a.m., Lisa was still gone. In those days, there were no cell phones, so he had no way to contact her. Instead, the guy started calling the police departments of the two states. He gave them information about Lisa and her car, wondering if anything had happened. The police accepted the information, but would not file a missing persons case. The reason for this was the fact that Lisa was 18 years old and too little time had passed since she disappeared. The guy waited a few more hours and then started calling mutual friends. None of them knew where she was missing. He also called Lisa's boss and then tried to contact her parents, but they were not at home. They came back hours later and their phone was ringing off the hook. Several people tried to contact them at once to see if they had heard from their daughter. At first, the parents thought Lisa had just been delayed and was still on the road. She had traveled this route many times before, and it was hard to imagine that anything could have happened to her, but time passed and she was still gone. By then, her parents had called Ed and called him over to their house. The first meeting that Lisa had planned for so long happened without her and under such unsettling circumstances. 2 days passed. The young woman was still unreachable, and the police refused to start looking for her. According to the law, it was necessary to wait 72 hours before filing a missing person report. The parents decided not to sit idly by and start searching on their own. Lisa's father hired a light aircraft pilot to fly along the road where the young woman was supposed to be. He hoped this would help locate her car, but the search was unsuccessful. The father also drove part of that route in his car, but he was unable to find any sign of Lisa. The family did not stop there. The young woman's parents contacted a private investigator they knew who had previously worked for the police. Thanks to his connections, he was able to convince the local police department to take an early missing person report. Unfortunately, they could not find any solid leads. The police immediately determined that their patrol officer had stopped Lisa the night she disappeared, but her fate remained unknown. Only one thing was clear. The young woman had disappeared with the car somewhere between Douglas and the town of Cody. The police had searched the area along that route, but there is one significant problem. We are talking about hundreds of miles of fields, woods, and mountains. It took months of work and thousands of people to cover the entire area. For this reason, the search on the ground made little or no progress. 8 days passed. On the morning of April 2nd, a man called the police. He said he was fishing in a river near Casper, Wyoming. At one point, he noticed a human body lying face down in the water. Shortly before, the fisherman had heard on the radio the police were looking for a missing young woman, so he immediately thought it was her. Detectives arrived on the scene, took the body out of the water, and determined that the deceased was indeed Lisa. Medical experts have studied the body and came to a terrible discovery. They determined that the young woman died about 6 days after her disappearance. That is, Lisa died just 2 days before the discovery, and detectives had to figure out where she was all this time. That said, police initially thought the death occurred about 5 hours after she disappeared, which later led to confusion. Doctors also determined that the young woman had been abused while alive, and on her body they found several stab wounds and contusions. Apparently, she had been thrown into the water from a bridge while she was unconscious. Police later confirmed this version, finding blood on the bridge. Finally, medical experts extracted biological material from the young woman's body, which turned out to be a sample of male semen and apparently belonged to the killer. It was sent to a lab, but in those years, the tools to study DNA were very scarce. The local lab simply did not have the necessary resources to extract the profile of the perpetrator. Detectives concluded that the killer was most likely a local resident who lived near the river. This was evidenced by the fact that the bridge from which the young woman had been thrown was located in a remote wilderness area. It had not been used for a long time, and in order to access it, one had to turn from the main road to a country road and then drive some distance. Based on that, the police assumed that only someone who knew the area well could have chosen this bridge for a body dump. Detectives focused on finding Lisa's car. They assumed that the killer had driven it somewhere and there might be additional clues in it. But the car seemed to have fallen under the ground and they could not find it. Investigators actively shared information about the case with the public, hoping that someone had useful information. The case was also widely televised, and a lot of people did come forward. But here's something strange started to happen. In all, the police received more than 100 calls. People said they had seen a Honda CRX with Little Miss plates, as well as Lisa herself. Only these testimonies came from different states and even Canada. A few appeals seemed more convincing to the police. 5 different witnesses claimed to have seen the very car with the license plate Little Miss, driven by a young woman who closely resembled Lisa. Except this was a few days after her disappearance on March 26th and 27th. It's hard to imagine that the young woman stayed in the Casper area for several days for whatever reason and didn't see fit to call her relatives. Moreover, she had to go to work on Monday, and she would never have missed it. One witness stated that there was a man sitting in the car with Lisa, but the police were unable to confirm this information. Based on all the inquiries, the detectives compiled 7 portraits of the alleged men seen near Lisa, but none of them were of any help to the investigation. The descriptions were too different to isolate any one man. The police questioned the words of all these witnesses. They conceded that the killer might have driven Lisa's car, but there was no logical explanation that she herself could have driven around the area all weekend without calling her parents from any nearby payphone. Apparently, one of the witnesses actually saw the killer drive Lisa's car to hide it, and the rest of the testimony is either erroneous or outright false. Police later determined that there were several similar car models registered in that area, and witnesses may well have seen them. During the investigation, detectives identified several suspects, but they all turned out not to have been involved in the case. 6 months later, police had a new tip. Someone pinned an envelope to Lisa's grave with a note. In it, on behalf of a man, it was written that he missed Lisa and called her death his painful loss. The letter was signed by Stringfellow Hawk, a character from a popular television series at the time. At first glance, there didn't seem to be anything suspicious about the note, but all of Lisa's relatives and acquaintances denied having anything to do with the letter. The detectives therefore assumed that it might have been left by the killer. In March 1989, exactly 1 year after Lisa's disappearance, the case was reported on a popular television program devoted to unsolved crimes. Given that it was watched by millions of viewers across the country, the police received numerous tip-off calls. It took months and extra manpower for local detectives to verify them. Lisa's parents felt that the local police department could not handle the volume of tips and leads that came in after the program aired. For this reason, they wanted the FBI to handle their daughter's murder. But Sheriff Ron Ketchum was very negative about the idea and said he had no intention of giving the case up. In spite of that, a year later, Lisa's parents still got federal investigators involved in the case, with the support of higher authorities. They became involved in the investigation and wanted to work with the sheriff, but he would not cooperate or even return their calls. Thanks to the FBI's involvement, the detectives were now able to examine a DNA sample from the victim's body at a federal lab. It was compared to Lisa's boyfriend's sample, and they did not match. He had not been considered a suspect before, but the investigators decided to be 100% sure. Next, they decided to check the patrolman who had stopped Lisa shortly before she disappeared. He had a recording of a conversation with the young woman that showed him saying goodbye to her, but detectives conceded that he might have found Lisa and attacked her later. The officer immediately agreed to provide his DNA sample,
and it did not match the killers. The next unexpected tip came after a local radio station aired a program about Lisa's murder. The police were contacted by a witness who stated that he had seen the young woman stop in the road as Sheriff Ron Ketchum on the day she disappeared. And there were some really suspicious moments here. The sheriff himself never said he stopped Lisa that night. He also actively opposed the FBI's involvement in the case, and just like that, exactly 2 years after Lisa's murder, a man quit the force and tried to take his own life. He was able to be recuperated and was undergoing psychological treatment at the time. Investigators came to him with questions, but Ron pleaded not guilty and refused to provide a DNA sample. This all looked suspicious, and the investigators began to seriously consider him as a suspect. But a few months later, when they were ready to apply for a court order for a DNA sample, the man did provide one himself, and it did not match the killer sample. It's not entirely clear why the sheriff was acting so strangely if he had nothing to do with Lisa's murder. His colleagues pointed out that he had always been a complicated and closed person who had been through Vietnam, so he was behaving this way even before the young woman's disappearance. At this point, the police ran out of serious leads. In 1992, they published more data on the case in the hope that they would be able to find new witnesses. According to the main version of the investigation, there could have been several perpetrators. Most likely, one man kidnapped and killed Lisa, but someone helped him get rid of the car. Investigators also believed that the young woman was kidnapped during a traffic stop at a gas station or somewhere else. They ruled out the option of Lisa picking up a hitchhiker because the young woman was very cautious. Shortly before these events, Lisa's car stalled on the road and another driver stopped to help her. The young woman did not get out of the car and only lowered her window slightly to talk to him because she understood the potential risk. The police never managed to get any new leads, and the case went cold for another 10 years. It wasn't until July 2002 that a long-awaited breakthrough awaited them. The local police department reopened the investigation, and the first thing they did was put the killer's DNA sample into the FBI database. It didn't yet exist in the late 80s, and it took many years for it to start being used en masse across the country. When they did add a sample from Lisa's body there, investigators immediately got a match. The sample belonged to a 59-year-old man named Dale Wayne Eaton, who was in prison at the time. He had been arrested in 1997 for armed assault on a family. A young couple and their child were driving through the Wyoming wilderness when their car stalled. Dale drove by and stopped to help. He inspected the car and said there was no way to fix it on the spot, so he offered the family a ride to the nearest service station, which supposedly belonged to his brother. They agreed and got into his van, and a few miles later, Dale said he was tired and needed to sleep. He asked the woman to drive, and he got into the back of a van himself. When the car moved, he pulled out his rifle and ordered the woman to pull off onto a country road. But the woman twisted the wheel so hard that Dale lost his balance and dropped his weapon. They got out of the car, and the perpetrator pulled out a knife. But at that moment, the father of the family grabbed the rifle and hit Dale with the buttstock. The family then got into his van and drove to the nearest police station. Detectives drove to the scene, located Dale nearby, and arrested him. During his trial, he was found to have a number of mental disabilities, so instead of going to jail, they sent him to a closed rehabilitation facility. The idea of the authorities was that he would spend several years there, during which time he would be helped to get on with his life, learn a profession, and so on. However, he escaped from there after a few months, for which he was arrested and sent to prison for 5 years. The important thing here is that before he was incarcerated, a DNA sample was taken from Dale and entered into the FBI database. It is because of this that investigators in the Lisa case finally got a match. He was 43 years old at the time of Lisa's murder and lived near that area. Upon examining Dale's background, law enforcement discovered an impressive list of offenses behind him. He committed his first serious crime at the age of 16. Dale sold a woman some watermelon and offered to help carry them home. When they entered the premises, the woman examined the watermelons and saw that they were rotten.
She refused to pay for them, and after a brief argument, Dale stabbed her and then fled. The guy was arrested the next day, and the court sent him to compulsory treatment. He was diagnosed with a number of moderate mental disorders. After receiving treatment, he kept changing jobs because he couldn't get a foothold in any job. Sometime later, he married and the couple had 3 children. The marriage was not happy. The couple quarreled constantly and divorced after 15 years. In 1996, he moved to a town called Moneta, just an hour away from Casper. There, his in-laws had several unfinished buildings and a bus converted to housing on the property. It was there that Dale settled in. There were no living conditions in that bus except for a small bed. Once in a while, he would go to a neighbor's house to take a shower. As a result, there was an inveterate repeat offender before the investigation whose DNA was found on Lisa's body, but they wanted more evidence before they could charge him. Officers arrived at the precinct where he lived before his arrest. Several neighbors lived a short distance away, and one of them told the detectives an interesting story. According to him, around the same time Lisa disappeared, Dale dug a huge hole on his property. He said he was going to put in a septic tank, but that never happened. Investigators dug up the lot and found what they had already guessed. Lisa's car with Little Miss plates was there. With all this in hand, the police set about gathering all the data they needed to build a win-win case against Dale, since they had more than enough time. While in prison, the man had killed his cellmate, so it would be a while before he got out. In April 2003, he was finally charged with the murder of Lisa Kimmel. The man refused to plead guilty, so the case went to trial. Because of the usual bureaucracy of the American judicial system, the trial did not begin until a year later. The prosecution summoned Dale's other cellmate to testify. According to him, the man confessed to him about Lisa's murder and told him all the details. The young woman allegedly saw him on the side of the road, stopped, and agreed to give him a ride. At one point, Dale began to molest her, but was rebuffed. Then he pulled out a gun and ordered her to his house, where he held her for several days and then killed her. But no one believed this version. Lisa's parents said she would never stop at night in the middle of nowhere to take a hitchhiker. Either Dale lied to his cellmate or he made up the story himself to reduce his sentence for testifying. So he clearly had a motive to lie. According to the investigation, that's not what happened. Most likely, Lisa stopped at a gas station, and that's where Dale attacked her. They even named a specific gas station between Casper and Dale's house. Lisa had to drive past it on her way to Cody. Dale himself often drove there to use the public restroom and sink, since he had no water on the property. Most likely, he got into her car and used a gun to force her to drive to some remote location, then brought her back to his station and held her in the bus. A few days later, he decided to get rid of her, took her to that bridge, stabbed her several times, and dumped her in the water. Experts also compared the handwriting of the note left on Lisa's grave with Dale's. They found a high similarity, but it was hard to call it evidence in court. Regardless, the DNA evidence on the body and the car on Dale's property was enough to convict him. Even the attorneys understood this, and they tried to avoid the death penalty for their client rather than a complete acquittal. They pointed to the mental abnormalities that made him unable to take full responsibility for his actions, but all was in vain. The jury found Dale guilty, and as a result, he was sentenced to death. Lisa's parents then filed a civil suit against him, which was granted by the court. Dale was seized from the land with the buildings on it and gave it all into the possession of the young woman's parents. Those, along with the fire department, burned all these structures to the ground on Lisa's birthday. Since the conviction, Dale's attorneys have filed numerous appeals to overturn the death penalty, which have always been rejected. But in 2010, the court did accept the appeal and set a new hearing. The appeal was accepted on the grounds that in imposing the sentence, the court failed to consider the offender's severe childhood, mental disabilities, and developmental delays. In addition, lawyers latched on to Dale's cellmate's testimony. The jury was not warned that the man had been promised a reduced sentence for this, so his testimony may well have been made up. Despite all this, there is no question of a complete reversal of the sentence. Dale is still in prison and is currently 78 years old, so the death penalty is unlikely to take place. There is one more point worth mentioning in this whole story. There have been several murders and strange disappearances of young women in the area where Dale lived, which have not yet been solved. The police have no evidence on hand, but they admit that Dale could have been the killer. His entire biography indicates that he is clearly prone to serial crimes, so Lisa Kimmel might not have been his only victim. Helene Prusinski was born on April 6, 1958, in Huntington, which was located near New York City. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old, respectively. The girl grew up in love and care, got along well with her older relatives, and was a positive, bright person. When she was 14, her father received a job offer, and the family had to move to the small town of Hamilton, near Boston. There she enrolled in the local school, where she developed a passion for singing and sports. At the same time, Helen decided that she wanted to tie her future life with journalism. After high school, she enrolled at Wheaton College, 110 kilometers from her town. It was close enough to visit her family regularly. In addition, the institution offered a truly quality education in journalism. Helen quickly adapted to student life, doing well in school and taking an active part in college life. Eventually, she had an opportunity she was looking forward to. She was to go to an internship at a radio news station located in Denver. Despite the fact that the city was more than 3,000 miles away from her college, Helene was excited about the opportunity. In addition, her uncle and aunt lived in Denver and agreed to take her in for the internship. With her also went a classmate who studied journalism. In January 1980, Helen, then 21, flew to Denver and began working at a radio station. Every day she had to take the bus from the office to her home. The trip took about 30 minutes, after which she had to walk several miles. On January 16th, she left the radio station as usual at 6 p.m. and went to the bus stop. The only thing was that she never showed up at home. Her aunt immediately began to worry because Helen had always warned her before if she planned to be somewhere late. The woman waited a few hours, but at 11:30, she decided to go to the police after all. Investigators had already begun a search immediately, fearing that her disappearance might be connected to a recent string of attacks on women in the area. They combed the area along Helen's route all night, but could not find her. In the morning, a woman approached the police. She was driving her car through a suburban area of Denver with her children. At one point, they noticed someone lying in a field near the road. The mother stopped the car, walked closer, and saw the body of a young girl with no signs of life. The police arrived on the scene and immediately identified Helen. Her clothes were partially missing, her hands were tied behind her back, and all her personal belongings were also missing. Later, medical experts determined that the girl had been stabbed 9 times and abused. The death occurred between 8 and 10 p.m. Police were able to find a witness who saw Helene get off the bus at about 5:30. She had several kilometers to walk from the bus stop, and it appears that the perpetrator attacked her at that point. Law enforcement agencies surveyed the area near where the body was found, but they were unable to find almost any clues other than shoe impressions, presumably size 44, that led from the road to the body and back. By then, medical examiners had found biological material on the victim's body and clothing that appeared to belong to the killer. Except that in those years, it could not help the investigation because the science of studying DNA was only at an early stage of development. but the samples were sent to a laboratory for storage, hoping that they would help identify the perpetrator in the future. Police turned to the public for information, using newspapers and local television. They tried to find witnesses who might have seen Helen that night. Soon they were approached by a woman who, at about 10:20 p.m., saw a man near the field where the body was found. He was standing on the side of the road next to a car. Unfortunately, it was dark outside at the time, and the woman could not get a good look at the man. She provided the police with only generalities that could not help them in any way. Then the detectives took a very interesting step. With the consent of the witness, they invited a hypnotist to the station, and the woman was able to remember more details, on the basis of which it turned out to draw a portrait of this unknown man. It is hard to say whether the hypnosis session really helped the investigation, but the fact remains that at that time, the police had nothing but this drawing, but they could not find a single suspect, and the case froze for years. 6 months later, Helen was posthumously awarded her college diploma as a mark of remembrance. In addition, school officials established an alumni award named in her honor. This award was given for the active participation in college life that had been inherent in Helen throughout her studies. The investigation was not reopened until 1998, 18 years after the murder. By then, technology in the field of DNA research had progressed markedly, and researchers had entered samples of biological material into the FBI database. Unfortunately, no matches were found. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal convictions, at least not since they began taking DNA samples from convicts. 15 more years passed, and in 2013, the local police department created a unit to handle unsolved cases. They reopened the investigation into Helen's murder, but no new leads could be found. A DNA sample from the victim's body never showed up in the FBI database. This meant that the girl's killer had not come to the attention of the police for other possible crimes all this time. Throughout all these years, Helen's relatives and police were not the only ones trying to find the truth. The girl's high school friends, with whom she was in the choir, took an active part in the investigation. Decades after her murder, they continued to press detectives to review the case regularly. They also gave interviews to get the story out to the public and distributed flyers about Helen's murder along her bus route. In 2017, the case was reopened again, and this time, the detectives had much more to go on. By this point, forensics had begun to make extensive use of genetic genealogy, by which the perpetrator's identity could be deduced through his relatives. Of course, this was a very complicated and time-consuming process. Moreover, this method worked only in the case if the relatives of the DNA possessor were in the publicly available genetic databases. There are several of these, and they are mostly used to search for family members. In 2018, police turned over available DNA samples to the Parabon lab, which had already helped solve hundreds of similar cases. Experts had about 3,000 matches to examine, including even the most distant relatives of the alleged killer. Then they had to sift out those who didn't fit the age or who couldn't commit the crime for other reasons. Ultimately, the experts determined that the person with the DNA was very likely the son of a woman named June Estes, who was no longer alive at the time. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the lab was only able to identify 2 of them. They were 10 and 11 years old at the time of the murder, so they were ruled out right away. The search for the other 2 sons dragged on, and experts began to explore other options. Another year passed before something unexpected happened. A woman named Jessie entered her DNA sample into a public database, which was the primary tool for finding criminals. Experts at Parabon immediately saw that Jessie was a fairly close relative of Helen's killer and contacted her. In a more detailed DNA examination, the experts determined that Jesse's third cousin was the killer. Detectives asked the woman for information about her family to finally identify the suspect, and luckily, Jesse was into podcasts about various crimes like Helen's murder. It was for this reason that she put her information into the open database. After all, genetic genealogy can be used to find a person through even the most distant relatives, and Jessie knew she could help solve a case with her decision. However, she could not have imagined that this would happen immediately after uploading her data into the database. The woman began collecting information about her family tree and asked both of her parents to enter their DNA into the database. Through this, experts at Parabon determined that the killer was related to Jessie on her father's side. Unfortunately, the search for an answer will drag on for several more months. Experts, detectives, and Jesse's family worked together to get closer to the owner of the DNA from the murder scene, and soon it finally happened. The cops were able to reach a relative of June Estes, and he gave new details about her older sons. It turned out that the woman suffered from mental problems, and after her next breakdown, her father took the boys and took them to another town. Their names were William and Curtis, and the detectives were to find out which one of them was the killer. The answer was not long in coming. The cops immediately discovered that William had been incarcerated multiple times, and his DNA sample was entered into the FBI database in 2010. Given that the sample from Helen's body has been run through that database repeatedly since then, William was not the killer. The downside of this database is that it only shows a full match, not a partial match, even when brothers are involved. As a result, 39 years after the murder, the police had a prime suspect, Curtis White, who also used the last name Clanton. It turned out that this man also had a rich criminal history under his belt. When he was 18 years old, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside, he grabbed a knife and abused the victim before fleeing. He was quickly caught and imprisoned for 30 years, except he was released after 4 years. He was released early because he was defended by an employee of a Christian institution for troubled teens, where Curtis had been before his majority for stealing a car. This man said he would be willing to house the offender in his home and find him a job. It's hard to imagine how you can bring a convicted felon into your home with your wife and 5 children, but this man asked the court to release Curtis on those terms. Upon his release, Curtis moved in and took a job as a gardener. At the time of Helen's murder, he was living in that area. He later moved to Florida, where the detectives went in 2019. Curtis was 62 years old at the time, working as a trucker. Before charging him with Helen's murder, investigators wanted more hard evidence. They monitored the man for about a week in an attempt to secretly obtain a sample of his DNA. First, they removed a milk carton from his trash can and sent it to the lab. Experts found someone's DNA on it, but there was too little to analyze. On November 30th, detectives followed him to a bar where the suspect drank several bottles of beer from the same glass. As soon as he left, that glass was seized and shipped to a lab in Colorado. It took almost a month to transport and examine, but eventually, the detectives had the long-awaited result in their hands. The sample from the victim's body matched Curtis's DNA exactly. He was arrested on December 11 and charged with Helen's murder. The man denied any involvement in the case, so the prosecutor was preparing to take the case to court, and the man himself was extradited to Colorado, and here, something unexpected happened. On the way there, he began to gradually confess to what he had done. The detectives who accompanied him listened to all the details of the crime. Curtis said he was driving down the street and noticed a lonely girl getting off the bus. Pulling out a knife, he forced her into his car for the purpose of committing acts of violence. He then drove her out of town, abused her, and killed her. As a result, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Considering that he will be 82 years old by then, the perpetrator may well not live to see that day. Unfortunately, most of Helen's own relatives did not wait for the killer to be punished either. Her parents and older brother had passed away many years before, and only her older sister survived. Nearly 40 years later, the elderly woman received a call from the police station, finally informing her that the case had been solved. There remains one more creepy moment in this whole story. As you may recall, at the time of Helen's murder, there were repeated incidents of abuse of women in Denver, and these crimes had a common MO. Now detectives think Curtis was behind them, but they can no longer prove it.